Shmee. Alright, let me turn ads off. No ads in the book reading. Oops. Not mean to click on that. Stupid fucking pop-up. Oh my god, stop it. Okay. Oh, hello. Thank you for the follow. Starry the kitty cat. Hope you're having a good day today. I would usually expect Reacher to follow sometime in the middle of the stream. Literally just click the button, but yeah. So let's use that go live thing they added to Blue Sky. Wow. It's really messed up. Okay. And then I have a role in my Discord for reading these like books or whatever, but I don't know if anyone actually. Yeah. There's probably like one guy who actually clicks on the thing when I add the role. Well, I'll do it anyway. Okay. Last time we covered chapter 19, that was Vietnam. Oh, right, let me change the text to be the, I don't remember if I usually put anything important in the bottom text for these. I guess I could just leave it as... Let me take a look at what I had for the last one. Okay, yeah, it's just a description of what I was doing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We're only on page 133 out of 472. Wow, was that? Okay. Cambodia, 1955, 1973. I skip the rest of this track. Prince Sihanouk walks the high wire of neutralism. John Foster Dulles is back. John Foster Dulles had called on me in his capacity as Secretary of State, and he had exhausted every argument to persuade me to place Cambodia under the protection of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. I refused. I considered SEATO an aggressive military alliance directed against neighbors whose ideology I did not share, but with whom Cambodia had no quarrel. I had made all this quite clear to John Foster, an acidy, arrogant man, but his brother, CIA Director Alan Dulles, soon turned up with a briefcase full of documents proving that Cambodia was about to fall victim to communist aggression, and that the only way to save the country, the monarchy, and myself was to accept the protection of SEATO. The proofs did not coincide with my own information, and I replied to Alan Dulles as I had replied to John Foster. Cambodia wanted no part of SEATO. We would look after ourselves as neutrals and Buddhists. There was nothing for the Secret Service chief to do but pack up his dubious documents and leave. Prince Norodom Sihanouk in his memoirs. Oh, I should get a bottle of water too. I'm gonna be dry. I'm gonna get it shoveled out. I have to use my 300 ml bottle instead of 1.5 liter bottle this time. We're out of big water bottles. Okay. The visits of the brothers' duels in 1955 appear to have been the opening salvos in a campaign of extraordinary measures aimed at pressuring the charismatic Cambodian leader into aligning his nation with the West and joining the holy war against communism. The coercion continued intermittently until 1970, when Sihanouk was finally overthrown in an American-backed coup and the United States invaded Cambodia. In March 1956, after Sihanouk had visited Peking and criticized Sito, the two countries which sandwich Cambodia, Thailand and South Vietnam, both heavily dependent upon and allied with the United States, suddenly closed their borders. It was a serious move, for the bulk of Cambodia's traffic with the outside world at that time passed either along the Mekong River through South Vietnam or by railway through Thailand. The danger to the tiny kingdom was heightened by repeated military provocations. Thai troops invaded Cambodian territory, and CIA-financed irregulars began to make commando raids from South Vietnam. Deep intrusions were made into Cambodian airspace by planes based in the two countries. To Sihanouk, these actions looked more and more like preliminary softening up probes for his overthrow. He chose to thrust matters out into the open. At a press conference, he scolded the U.S., defended Cambodia's policy of neutrality, and announced that the whole question would be on the agenda of his party's upcoming National Congress. There was the implication that Cambodia would turn to the Socialist Bloc for aid. The United States appeared to retreat in the face of this unorthodox public diplomacy. The State Department sent a couple of rather conciliatory messages which nullified a threatened cutoff of certain economic aid and included this remarkable piece of altruism. The only aim of American policy to Cambodia is to help her strengthen and defend her independence. 2 days before the National Congress convened, Thailand and South Vietnam opened their frontiers. The local disputes which the two countries had cited as the reasons for the blockade had not been resolved at all. The measures taken against Cambodia were counterproductive. Not only did Sihanouk continue to attack Sito, but he established relations with the Soviet Union and Poland, and accepted aid from China. He praised the latter lavishly for treating Cambodia as an equal and for providing aid without all the strings which, he felt, came attached to American aid. Alright. Gift sub discount. Lol. You're only allowed to toggle that on before you start a stream? I guess that don't really matter. No one's gonna use it anyway. Okay. The measures taken against Cambodia were counterproductive. Whoops, I read that already. Such behavior should not obscure the fact that Sihanouk was as genuine a neutralist as one could be in such a highly polarized region of the world in the midst of the Cold War. He did not shy away from denouncing China, North Vietnam, or communism on a number of occasions when he felt that Cambodia's security or neutrality was being threatened. I foresee perfectly well, he said at one time, the collapse of an independent and neutral Cambodia after the complete triumph of communism in Laos and South Vietnam. In May 1957, a National Security Council paper acknowledged that the United States has been unable to influence Cambodia in the direction of a stable, i.e. pro-Western, government and non-involvement in the communist bloc. The following year, 5 battalions of Saigon troops, supported by aircraft, crossed the Cambodian border again. Wait, Saigon is... let me see. Oh. Okay, it's now known as Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam's capital, I guess. Maybe, I guess it was probably in South Vietnam. I don't know. Following year, 5 battalions of Saigon troops, supported by aircraft, crossed the Cambodian border again, penetrated to a depth of almost 10 miles, and began putting up new boundary markers. Sihanouk's impulse was to try and repel the invaders, but, to his amazement, he was informed by the American ambassador to Cambodia, Karl Strom, that U.S. military aid was provided exclusively for the purpose of opposing communist aggression and in no case could be used against an American ally. The ambassador cautioned that if a single bullet were fired at the South Vietnamese, or a single U.S. supplied truck used to transport Cambodian troops to a military confrontation with them, this would constitute grounds for canceling aid. Ambassador Strom was called back to Washington, told that Sihanouk would now have to go, and that U.S. aid would be cut off to precipitate his fall. Strom, however, did not think that this was the wisest move to make at that point, and was able to convince the State Department to hold off for the time being. William Shawcross, in his elaborately researched book, Sideshow, Kissinger, Nixon, and the Destruction of Cambodia, notes that NSC papers of the period, cited in the Pentagon Papers, confirmed that Washington saw Thai and Vietnamese pressure across the borders as one of the principal weapons to be used in an effort to move Sihanouk toward a more pro-American position. In addition to Thai and South Vietnamese troops, the CIA had at its disposal two other forces, the Khmer Serai and the Khmer Krom, composed largely of ethnic Cambodians opposed to Sihanouk's rule, who operated out of the two neighboring countries. The Khmer Serai, Free Cambodians, were described by Shawcross as the Cambodian organization with which American officials had the closest contact. Sihanouk once equated them to the free Cubans the United States maintained in Florida. I saw a thing recently mentioning that Marco Rubio, he's in the United States something or other leadership. His parents were from Cuba, but they actually immigrated away before Castro overthrew the government or whatever. Right-wing Cuban diaspora. Okay. These forces, recruited, financed, armed, and trained by the CIA and the U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets, began to infiltrate into Cambodia in the latter part of 1958 as part of a complex conspiracy which included, amongst others, a disloyal Cambodian general named Dap Chuan, who was plotting an armed uprising inside the country. At its most optimistic, the conspiracy aimed at overthrowing Sihanouk. Sihanouk discovered the plan, partly through reports from Chinese and French intelligence. The French were not happy about the American intrusion into what had been their domain for close to a century. By February 1959, the conspirators had been apprehended or had fled, including Victor Masao Matsui, a member of the CIA station in Cambodia's capital city, Phnom Penh, who hurriedly left the country after Sihanouk accused him of being a party to the plot. Matsui, an American of Japanese descent, had been operating under State Department cover as an attaché at the embassy. The intrigue, according to Sihanouk, began in September 1958 at a SEATO meeting in Thailand and was carried a step further later that month in New York when he visited the United Nations. While Sihanouk was away in Washington for a few days, a member of his delegation, Zlat Peo, held several conferences with Americans in his New York hotel room, which he did not mention to any of his fellow delegates. Zlat Peo, it happened, was a close friend of Victor Matsui and was the brother of General Dap Chuan. In the aftermath of the aborted conspiracy, Zlat Peo was executed for treason. Sihanouk was struck by the bitter irony of the CIA plotting against him in New York, while he was in Washington, being honored by President Eisenhower with a 21-gun salute. Oh. Okay. In a similar vein, several years later, President Kennedy assured Sihanouk, on his honor, that the United States had played no role in the affairs of the Khmer Serai. I consider President Kennedy to be an honorable man, wrote Sihanouk, but in that case, who really represented the American government? CIA officer, later director, William Colby, stationed in Vietnam at the time of the Dap Chuan plot, has written that the agency was well aware of the plot and had recruited someone on Dap Chuan's staff and furnished him with a radio with which to keep the CIA informed. The agency wanted to be kept informed, Colby asserts, in order to dissuade the Thai and Vietnamese from overthrowing Sihanouk. Colby adds, unfortunately, in putting down the coup, Sihanouk had captured our agent and his radio, and, not unnaturally, he drew the conclusion that CIA was one of the participants, and that the golden arms furnished from Bangkok and Saigon to be used against him were only part of the overall plot, of which the radio was a key element. I think the whole thing of the silly presidents who don't know what's going on, well, they're still anti-communists. It's just like set dressing. Doesn't really matter if they believe their own ideology or not, or whatever. BBB. Cambodian leader has attested to several of their plots he lays at the doorstep of the CIA. Amongst these was a 1959 effort to murder him, which was foiled when the police picked a nervous young man, Ratvat. It's not Ratvat. Ratvat, my name. Out of a crowd surrounding Sihanouk. He was found to be carrying a hand grenade and a pistol. Investigation showed, writes Sihanouk, that the would-be assassin was instigated by the CIA and the Khmer Zerai. Sihanouk also cites 3 incidents occurring in 1963. An attempt to blow up a car carrying him and the visiting president of China, Liu Shaoqi, an attempt to smuggle arms into Cambodia, and a number of crates. Oh, that'd actually be true. Whatever. An attempt to smuggle arms to Cambodia and a number of crates addressed to the U.S. Embassy, and a partially successful venture aimed at sabotaging the Cambodian economy and subverting key government personnel through the setting up of a bank in Phnom Penh. I don't know why I said it like that. On 20th November the same year, 2 days before the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Cambodian National Congress, at Sihanouk's initiative, voted to end all aid granted by the United States in the military, economic, technical, and cultural fields. It was perhaps without precedent that a country receiving American aid voluntarily repudiated it, but Sihanouk held strong feelings on the subject. Over the years, he had frequently recited from his register of complaints about American aid to Cambodia, how it subverted and corrupted Cambodian officials and businessmen who wound up constituting a clientele necessarily obedient to the demands of the lavish bestower of foreign funds, and how the aid couldn't be used for state institutions, only private enterprise, nor, as mentioned earlier, used against attacks by U.S. allies. Oh, thanks for the water. After some American bombings of Cambodian villages near the South Vietnamese border in pursuit of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, the Cambodian government, in October 1964, announced that, in case of any new violation of Cambodian territory by U.S. ground, air, or naval forces, Cambodia will immediately sever diplomatic relations with the United States. The government did just that the following May when American planes bombarded several villages, killing or wounding dozens of peasants. The pattern over the next few years, as the war in Indochina intensified, was one of repeated forays into Cambodian territory by American, Saigon, and Khmer Serai forces in search of communist supply lines and sanctuaries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bombing and strafing, napalming, and placing landmines, with varying numbers of Cambodian civilian casualties. Angry accusations by the Cambodian government, followed on occasion by an American apology, promise of an investigation, and the taking of measures to prevent any recurrence of such incidents. Sihanouk did not at all relish the intrusions into Cambodia by the Vietnamese communists, nor was he wholly or consistently antagonistic to American pursuit of them, particularly when there was no loss of Cambodian lives. On at least one occasion, he disclosed the location of communist bases, which were promptly bombed by the U.S. However, Sihanouk then went on the radio and proceeded to denounce the bombings. Opportunist that he often revealed himself to be, Sihanouk was nonetheless truly caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. I don't know, I can go for a swim. No big deal. And by the late 1960s, His predicament had compelled him to resume American aid and re-establish diplomatic relations with the United States. Despite all the impulsiveness of his personality and policies, Sihanouk's neutralist high wire balancing act did successfully shield his country from the worst of the devastation that was sweeping through the land and people of Vietnam and Laos. Cambodia had its own communist insurgents, the Khmer Rouge, who surely would have unleashed a full-scale civil war faced with the Cambodian government nestled comfortably in the American camp. And the Khmer Rouge is led by Pol Pot, if I remember. I did a quick Google check, but I didn't bother to actually go look at Wikipedia page or whatever. Some little guys say that Pol Pot's ideology, although he said he was a communist party and called himself a communist, that his ideology may not have actually been super coherent. You know, Khmer Rouge killed a lot of whatever. Let me take a look. Cambodian genocide? Yeah. That's not exactly revolutionary activity. Okay. See, this is precisely what, let's see, full-scale civil war. Cambodian government nestled comfortably in the American camp. This is precisely what later came to pass following the overthrow of Sihanouk and his replacement by Lon Nol, who was closely tied to the United States. In March 1969, the situation began to change dramatically. Under the new American president, Richard Nixon, and National Security Affairs Advisor Henry Kissinger, the isolated and limited attacks across the Cambodian border became sustained, large-scale B-52 bombings, carpet bombings, and the euphemistic language so dear to the hearts of military men. This is totally unrelated, but there's someone I'm following on Fur Affinity who posts an above-average amount of furries wearing no pants, holding guns, or otherwise, whatever, in military contexts. One of their latest ones was like airplane mechanic or something. I hate gun furries. No, okay. Over the next 14 months, no less than, I don't even remember. If you like military aesthetic, I side-eye you. Over the next 14 months, no less than 3,630 B-52 bombing raids were flown over Cambodia. To escape the onslaught, the Vietnamese communists moved their bases further inside the country. The B-52s, of course, followed, with a concomitant increase in civilian casualties. The Nixon administration artfully played down the nature and extent of these bombings, going so far as to falsify military records, and was largely successful in keeping it all a secret from the American public, the press, and Congress. Congress? Yeah, I don't know. It's not like you ever actually needed permission from Congress to do war anyway. And not until 1973, in the midst of the Watergate revelations, did a fuller story begin to emerge. It was frequently argued that the United States had every right to attack Cambodia because of its use as a sanctuary by America's foes in Vietnam. Apropos of this claim, William Shock. Every country is a sanctuary to the evil H-word terrorist organization. No. Apropos of this claim, William Shawcross has pointed out that during the Algerian War of Independence, the United States rejected France's claimed right to attack a Tunisian town inhabited by Algerian guerrillas, and in 1964, Adlai Stevenson at the UN condemned Britain for assaulting a Yemeni town used as a base by insurgents attacking Aden. Even Israel had frequently been criticized by the United States for attacks on enemy bases outside its territory. On 18th March 1970, Sihanouk, while on trip abroad, was deposed as head of state by two of his leading ministers, Lon Nol and Zirik Matak. To what extent, if any, the United States played a direct role in the coup has not been established, but there are circumstances and testimony pointing to American complicity, among which are the following. Take a sip real quick. According to Frank Snap, the CIA's principal political analyst in Vietnam at this time, in early 1970, the agency was cultivating both Lon Nol and Son Ngoc Tan, leader of the Khmer Sarai, as... I thought I turned... Whatever, it's still showing that. Let me just refresh that. Son Ngoc Khan and Tan, leader of the Khmer Sarai, as possible replacements for Sihanouk. The CIA believed, he says, that if Lon Nol came to power, he would welcome the United States with open arms, and we would accomplish everything. This presumably meant carte blanche to wipe out Vietnamese communist forces and sanctuaries in Cambodia, as opposed to Sihanouk's extremely equivocal position on the matter. Both men, as matters turned out, served as prime minister in the new government, for which diplomatic recognition was immediately forthcoming from Washington. The United States could seemingly also rely on Zinc Matak, a committed anti-communist who had been profiled by the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency as a friend of the West and cooperative with U.S. officials during the 1950s. Excuse me. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, in his biographic work on Kissinger, states that Sihanouk's immediate overthrow had been for years a high priority of the Green Berets reconnaissance units operating inside Cambodia since the late 1960s. There is also incontrovertible evidence that Lon Nol was approached by agents of American military intelligence in 1969 and asked to overthrow the Sihanouk government. Sihanouk made similar charges in his 1973 memoir, My War with the CIA, but they were not taken seriously then. An opponent of Sihanouk, Prom Dos, who became a minister in the new government, has said that whether Lon Nol had specific promises of American help for the coup is unimportant. We all just knew that the United States would help us. There had been many stories of CIA approaches and offers before then. I'm going to zoom this in a bit just for for this text, because it's like smaller. They crunched it. They're not using all the space. The CIA's intimate links to the conspiratorial circle are exemplified by an agency report prepared 6 days before the coup entitled Indications of Possible Coup in Phnom Penh. It disclosed that anti-communist demonstrations against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese embassies in the capital the previous day had been planned by Zirik Matak and Lon Nol as part of a showdown policy against Sihanouk and his followers, and that the two men had put the army on alert to prepare for a coup against Sihanouk if Sihanouk refused to support them. Oh. General William Rossum, deputy to General Creighton Abrams, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam at the time, has declared that American commanders were informed several days beforehand that a coup was being planned and that United States support was solicited. Roger Morris, who was serving under Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council staff when the coup took place, reported that it was clear in the White House that the CIA station in Phnom Penh knew the plotters well, probably knew their plans, and did nothing to alert Sihanouk. They informed Washington well in advance, I guess. There might be a whole line missing there. William Shaw Cross asserts that had Sihanouk returned quickly and calmly to Phnom Penh following the anti-communist demonstrations, he would most likely have been able to avert disaster. That he did not do so may not have been by chance. Frank Snep has revealed that the CIA persuaded Sihanouk's mother, the Queen, to send a message to her son abroad, reassuring him that the situation was not serious enough to warrant his return. Damn it, Mom. You screwed everything. You shouldn't have listened to those nice old men from the CIA. Can't believe this shit. Oh. Okay. With Sihanouk and his irritating neutralism no longer an obstacle, American military wheels began to spin. Within hours of the coup, U.S. and South Vietnam forces stationed in border districts were directed to establish communication with Cambodian commanders on the other side and take steps toward military cooperation. The next day, the Cambodian army called in an American spotter plane. Oh, called in as in... Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, right, because they've been cooed. The next day, the Cambodian army called in an American spotter plane and South Vietnamese artillery during the sweep of a Viet Cong sanctuary by a battalion of Cambodian troops inside Cambodia. The New York Times declared that the battle appeared to be the most determined Cambodian effort yet to drive the Viet Cong out of border areas. The Great Cambodian War had begun. It was to persist for 5 terrible years. The enemy confronting the United States and its Saigon and Phnom Penh allies was now not simply the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, had entered the conflict as had sundry Cambodian supporters of Prince Sihanouk. On 30th of April 1970, the first full-scale American invasion of the new war was launched. It produced a vast outcry of protest in the United States, which didn't do shit. Rocking university campuses. Sorry. Cynical. Rocking university campuses from coast to coast. Perhaps the most extraordinary reaction was the angry resignation of 4 men from Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff, including Roger Morris, to be replaced with more compliant guys. No, I don't know. I don't remember where or who said, but the amount of effect that university campus protests really had on the Vietnam War or Cambodia or another one. South African apartheid. It was probably very little. The Vietnamese people freed themselves. Yeah, I don't know. Me. Let's see. Rocking university campuses. By the end of May, scores of villages had been reduced to rubble and ashes by U.S. air power. The long train of Cambodian refugees had begun their march. 3 years and more than 100,000 tons of bombs later, 22nd January 1973 to be precise, an agreement was signed in Paris, putting an end to a decade of American warfare in Vietnam. The bombing of Cambodia, however, continued. Prior to the Paris Agreement, the official position of the Nixon administration, repeatedly asserted, was that the sole purpose of bombing Cambodia was to protect American lives in Vietnam. Yet now, the U.S. not only did not cease the bombing, it increased it in a last desperate attempt to keep the Khmer Rouge from coming to power. During March, April, and May, the tonnage of bombs unleashed over Cambodia was more than double that of the entire previous year. The society's traditional economy had vanished. The old Cambodia was being destroyed forever. Under increasing pressure from Congress, the Nixon administration finally ended the bombing in August. More than 2 million Cambodians had been made homeless. It does appear rather ludicrous, in the light of this application of brute force, that the CIA was at the same time carrying out the most subtle of psychological tactics. To spread dissatisfaction about the exiled Sihanouk amongst the Cambodian peasantry who revered him, a CIA sound engineer, using sophisticated electronics, fashioned an excellent counterfeit of the prince's distinctive voice and manner of speaking, breathless, high-pitched, and full of giggles. His voice was beamed from a clandestine radio station in Laos with messages artfully designed to offend any good Cambodian. In one of the broadcasts, Sihanouk exhorted young women to aid the cause by sleeping with the valiant Viet Cong. In a farewell press conference in September 1973, American ambassador to Cambodia, Emery Swank, who is totally lacking of swankiness, called what had taken place there Indochina's most useless war. Taxpayer dollars, blah, blah, blah. Later, California Congressman Pete McCloskey, following a visit to Cambodia, had harsher words. He was moved to declare that what the United States had done to this country is greater evil than we have done to any country in the world, and wholly without reason, except for our own benefit to fight against the Vietnamese. Which was totally different and justified, you know. No. On 17th April 1975, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh in victory. 2 weeks later, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Incredibly, the Khmer Rouge were to inflict even greater misery upon this unhappy land. And to add to the irony, or to multiply it, the United States supported the Khmer Rouge after their subsequent defeat by the Vietnamese, both by defending their right to the United Nations Cambodian seat and in their military struggle against the Cambodian government and its Vietnamese allies. In November 1980, Ray Klein, former deputy director of the CIA, visited a Khmer Rouge enclave in Cambodia in his capacity as senior foreign policy advisor to President-elect Ronald Reagan. A Khmer Rouge press release spoke of the visit in warm terms. This was in keeping with the Reagan administration's subsequent opposition to the Vietnamese-supported Phnom Penh government. A lingering bitter hatred of Vietnam by unreconstructed American Cold Warriors appears to be the only explanation for this policy. Oh, that started me. Hello. Thank you for the follow. Speed the wagon with the small face. Okay, that was well, it wasn't exactly a short chapter, but it wasn't a long chapter either. (1957, 1973). I wish I had some chewing gum right now. My mouth feels a little... My teeth feel a little weird. Okay. Last 1957 and 1973. L'armée clandestine. Sorry. L'armée clandestine. For the past 2 years, zooming in for the quote. For the past 2 years, the U.S. has carried out one of the most sustained bombing campaigns in history against essentially civilian targets in northeastern Laos. Operating from Thai bases and from aircraft carriers, American jets have destroyed the great majority of villages and towns in the northeast. Severe casualties have been inflicted upon the inhabitants. Refugees from the Plain of Jars report they were bombed almost daily by American jets last year. They say they spent most of the past 2 years living in caves or holes. For Far Eastern Economic Review, Hong Kong, 1970. The Laos operation is something of which we can be proud as Americans. It has involved virtually no American casualties. What we are getting for our money there is, I think, to use the old phrase, very cost-effective. U. Alexis Johnson, U.S. Undersecretary of State, 1971. The United States, that's a typo, scanning typo. The United States undertook the bombing campaign because its ground war against the Pathet Lao had failed. The ground war had been carried out because the Pathet Lao were led by people whom the State Department categorized as communist, no more, no less. The Pathet Lao returns to warfare because of their experiences in working within the system. In 1957, the Pathet Lao Nation held 2 ministerial posts in the coalition government of National Union. This was during John Foster Dulles' era, and if there was anything the fanatic Secretary of State hated more than neutralism, it was a coalition with communists. This government featured both. There could be little other reason for the development of the major American intervention into this impoverished and primitive land of peasants. The American ambassador to Laos at the time, J. Graham Parsons, was to admit later, "I struggled for 16 months to prevent a coalition." In addition to its demand for inclusion in the coalition government, the Pathet Lao had called for diplomatic relations with the countries of the Soviet bloc and the acceptance of aid from them, as was already the case with Western nations. Agreement to these conditions, said Washington, would have given the communists the most significant gains in Southeast Asia since the partition of Indochina. Others would say that the Pathet Lao's conditions were simply what neutralism is all about. Slurping on both. That's neutral. In May 1958, the Pathet Lao and other leftists, running a campaign based on government corruption and indifference, won 13 of 21 contested seats for the National Assembly and wound up controlling more than one-third of the new legislature. 2 months later, however, Prime Minister Sovana Thoma, a man universally categorized as a neutralist, resigned to form a new government which would exclude the Pathet Lao ministers. He subsequently claimed that he was forced to resign due to continued American opposition to Laotian neutrality. As that happened one Pui Zananikone, backed by the U.S., became premier in the reorganized government. Then, in January 1959, the non-left majority in the National Assembly voted, in effect, to dissolve the assembly in order to counteract communist influence and subversion. The left was now altogether excluded from the government, and the elections scheduled for December were cancelled. So democratic. /J. If this wasn't enough to disenchant the Pathet Lao or anyone else within the Laotian political process, there was, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the spectacle of a continuous parade of coups and counter-coups, of men overthrown, winding up in the new government, and regimes headed by men who had sided with the French in their war against Indo-Chinese independence, while the Pathet Lao had fought against the colonialists. There were as well government-rigged elections, with the CIA stuffing ballot boxes, different regimes, cum warlords. I don't know what ligma cum loud means. Trying to whatever. Different regimes / warlords governing simultaneously from different capitals, their armies fighting each other, switching allies and enemies when it suited them, hundreds of millions of US dollars pouring into a tiny kingdom which was 99% agricultural, with an economy based more on barter than money, the result being unimaginable bribery, graft, currency manipulation, and waste. The CIA and the State Department alone could take credit for engineering coups through force, bribery, or other pressures, at least once in each of the years 1958, 1959, and 1960, if not in others, by merely withholding the monthly payment to the troops, wrote Roger Hilsman, whose career encompassed both agencies, perhaps covertly simultaneously. The United States could create the conditions for toppling any Lao government whose policies it opposed. As it turned out, in fact, the United States used this weapon twice, to bring down the government of one Lao leader and to break the will of another. The American wheeling and dealing centered around giving power to the CIA's handpicked, righteous strongman, Phumi Nosavan, ousting Sovana Phuma and other neutralists, and jailing Pathet Lao leaders, including the movement's head, Sophanuvong. Yes, Sophanuvong, the half-brother of Sovana Phuma, both being princes of the royal family. Sophanuvong insisted that neither he nor the Pathet Lao were communist, but were rather ultra-nationalist. Crucial to understanding his statements, of course, is the question of exactly what he meant by the term communist. This is not clear, but neither is it clear what the State Department meant when it referred to him as such. The Pathet Lao were the only sizable group in the country serious about social change, a characteristic which, of course, tends to induce Washington officials to apply the communist label. In August 1960, Kong Le, a military officer with his own troop following, staged a coup and set up a neutralist government under Sovana Phoma, rejecting Pathet Lao help. But when this government became a casualty of a CIA coup in December, Kong Le allied himself with the Pathet Lao. Later, he turned to the United States for aid and fought against the Pathet Lao. Such was the way of the Laotian circus. No study of Laos of this period appears to have had notable success in untangling the muddle of who exactly replaced whom, and when, and how, and why. After returning from Laos, writer Norman Cousins stated in 1961 that, if you want to get a sense of the universe unraveling, come to Laos. Complexity such as this has to be respected. Yeehaw, giddy up, partner. One thing that came through unambiguously, however, was the determination of the United States to save Laos from communism and neutralism. To this end, the CIA set about creating its now famous Armée Clandestine, a process begun by the U.S. Army in the mid-1950s when it organized Mayo Hill tribesmen, the same ethnic group organized in Vietnam. Over the years, other peoples of Laos were added, reaching at least 30,000 in the mid-1960s, half of them more or less full-time soldiers, many thousands more from Thailand, Hundreds of other Asians came on board: South Vietnamese, Filipinos, Taiwanese, South Koreans, men who had received expert training from their American mentors in their home countries for other wars, now being recycled. An army, said the New York Times, armed, equipped, fed, paid, guided, strategically and tactically, and often transported into and out of action by the United States. Yeah, I never can. I want to send any of your own American men or whatever. Just make them crunch each other. Trained and augmented by the CIA and by men of every branch of the U.S. military with their multiple specialties, many pilots of the CIA's Air America, altogether some 2,000 Americans in and over Laos, and thousands more in Asia helping with the logistics. A secret array, secret that is from the American people in Congress. Is that supposed to be army? That makes more sense. A secret army, secret that is from the American people in Congress. U.S. military personnel were there under various covers, some as civilians in Mufti, having... What is Mufti? Plain or... Use of the word to mean non-uniform dress, civilian clothes, civies. But it's also a Muslim legal expert who's empowered to give rulings on religious matters. Okay. Some civilians having resigned from the service for the occasion and being hired by a private company created by the CIA. Others served as embassy attaches. CIA pilots were officially under contract to the Agency for International Development, AID. Oh yeah, that's USAID. I didn't actually know what that stood for. I thought it was just aid, like, yeah, here's your food and water. But no, it stands for Agency for International Development, like developing your country into a capitalist hellhole or whatever. Although they did actually send aid, but it's not specifically for the aid itself, is to like make client countries dependent economically. Okay. Americans who were killed in Laos were reported to have died in Vietnam. Oh. All this in addition to the official government forces, the Royal Laotian Army, greatly expanded and totally paid for by the United States. Laos was an American plantation, a CIA playground. During the 1960s, the agency roamed over much of the land at will, building an airstrip, a hangar or a base here, a warehouse, barracks, or a radar site there, relocating thousands of people, entire villages, whole tribes, to suit strategic military needs, recruiting warriors through money and or the threat or use of force and or promises of independent kingdoms which it had no intention of fulfilling, and then keeping them fighting long beyond the point when they wished to stop. While the legendary pilots of Air America roamed far and wide as well, hard drinking, daredevil flying, death defying, great stories to tell the guys back home if you survived. Some of the stories had to do with drugs. Flying opium and heroin all over Indochina to serve the personal, oh my god, CIA has always been dealing drugs. No, flying opium and heroin all over Indochina to serve the personal and entrepreneurial needs of the CIA's various military and political allies, ultimately turning numerous GIs in Vietnam into addicts. The operation was not a paragon of discretion. Heroin was refined in a laboratory located on the site of CIA headquarters in northern Laos. After a decade of American military intervention, Southeast Asia had become the source of 70% of the world's illicit opium and the major supplier of raw materials for America's booming heroin market. At the same time, the hearts and minds of the Laotian people, at least of those who could read, were not overlooked. The U.S. Information Agency was there to put out a magazine with a circulation of 43,000. This in a country where the circulation of the largest newspaper was 3,300. There were as well USIA wall newspapers, films, leaflet drops, and radio programs. In the face of it all, the Pathet Lao more than held their own. The CIA was overextended, and, unlike the motley band of Asians assembled by the agency, the soldiers of the Pathet Lao had some idea of what they were fighting for. The Soviet Union, aware of what the United States was doing in Laos, even if the American public was not, was alarmed by the establishment of a pro-American government in the country, and acceded to a Cold War knee reflex by sending military supplies to the Pathet Lao, though nothing remotely on the order of the US commitment. Beginning in the early 1960s, the North Vietnamese were aiding them as well. Hanoi's overriding interest in Laos was not necessarily the creation of a communist state, but the prevention of a belligerent government on its border. In January 1961, the New York Times reported that many Western diplomats in Vientiane, capital of Laos, feel the communists would have been content to leave Laos alone, provided she remained neutral and outside the United States' sphere of influence. Hanoi was concerned not only by the American political and military operations in Laos, but by the actions of U.S. Special Forces teams, which were entering North Vietnam to engage in espionage, sabotage, and assassination, and by the bombings of the country being carried out by the U.S. Air Force at a time when the war in South Vietnam was still but a shadow of what was to come. Later, as the wars in Vietnam and Laos became intertwined, Laos formed part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the principal route by which Hanoi supplied his comrades in South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese fought to protect it, as well as attacking American radar installations in Laos used to aid U.S. bombing of North Vietnam. The nature and extent of North Vietnam's aid to the Pathet Lao before this period is difficult to ascertain from Western sources, because such charges typically emanated from the Laotian government or the State Department. On a number of occasions, their report of a North Vietnamese military operation in Laos turned out to be a fabrication. William Lederer and Eugene Burdick in A Nation of Sheep summarized one of these non-events from the summer of 1959. The people of the United States were led to believe that Laos physically had been invaded by foreign communist troops from across its northern border. Our Secretary of State called the situation grave. Our ambassador to the UN called for world action. Our press carried scare headlines. Our senior naval officer implied armed intervention and was seconded by ranking congressmen. The entire affair was a fraud. No military invasion of Laos had taken place. There seemed no doubt that a war embracing thousands of troops, tanks, planes, and mass battles was raging. Regardless of how the accounts were worded, this was the picture given the nation. It had all been a ploy to induce Congress not to reduce aid for Laos, something seriously being considered because of the pervasive corruption which had been exposed concerning the aid program. The Laotian government and the large American establishment in Laos, each for their own reasons, were not about to let the golden goose slip away that easily. On the east... Is that supposed to be east? Whatever. On the East Day of 1960, the Laotian government announced to the world that 7 battalions of North Vietnamese troops had invaded the country. By all accounts, and by the utter lack of evidence, this claim as well cannot be taken seriously. And in 1962, oh, maybe it's supposed to be last day of 1960. And in 1962, reported Bernard Fall. No, I don't know. Lowercase L wouldn't really look that similar. And in 1962, reported Bernard Fall, the renowned French scholar on Indochina. After a battle between government forces and the Pathet Lao, in spite of the fact that Colonel Edwin Elder, the American commander in the area of the battle, immediately stated that there was no evidence to show that Chinese or North Vietnamese had participated in the attack. The Laotians and much of the U.S. press, and official Washington with them, immediately claimed that they were again faced with a large-scale foreign invasion. Shortly after Kennedy became president in January 1961, he made a sustained diplomatic effort to establish a coalition government in Laos, precisely what the Eisenhower administration and the CIA had done their best to sabotage. Oh, okay, is that why they assassinated him? No, it's too much of a nice guy. Shmee. Da-da-da. Although he sometimes fell back on conventional Cold War rhetoric when speaking of Laos, one part of John F. Kennedy realized the absurdity of fighting for the backward country, a land he considered not worthy of engaging the attention of great Great powers. Soviet Premier Khrushchev, for his part, was reportedly bored with the question of Laos and irritably asked Kennedy's emissary why Washington bothered so much about the country. Eventually, in July 1962, a multi-nation conference in Geneva signed an agreement for a coalition government in Laos, but in the mountains and in the plains of the country, this was no longer a viable option. The CIA had too much time, effort, material, and emotion invested in its secret army. It was the best war the agency had going anywhere. It was great adventure, and the Pathet Lao were much stronger now than a few years earlier. They were not about to buy such shop-worn, suspect goods again, although everyone went through the motions. Both sides regularly accused each other of violating the agreement, and not without justification. The North Vietnamese, for example, did not withdraw all of their troops from Laos, while the US left behind all manner of military personnel, American and Asian, who remained under AID and other civilian cover, but this was nonetheless a violation of the agreement. Moreover, Christopher Robbins, in his study of Air America, has noted that U.S. military advisors and CIA personnel moved across the border into Thailand, where they were flown in every day to Laos like commuters by Air America, whose entire helicopter operation was based in Udon, Thailand. Air America, by the early 1970s, had no less than 4,000 employees in Thailand. Thus it was that the fighting dragged on, though only sporadically. And the reason that tooth feels weird is because it's the one with the feeling. I ate some candy canes last night. They were brutal candies trying to destroy my teeth. These fillings are kind of old. They might get yanked out one day by some especially chewy, crunchy food. And then I'm going to have to go to dentist, and it's going to cost me $9 million. Let's see. Thus it was that the fighting dragged on, though only sporadically. In April 1964, the coalition government, such as it was overthrown by the right wing, with the CIA's man Phumi Nosavan emerging as part of a rightist government headed by the perennial survivor Sovana Phuma to give it a neutralist fig leaf, covering up their big warmongering cock. Damn. The Pathet Lao were once again left out in the cold. For them, it was the very last straw. The fighting greatly intensified. The skirmishes were now war, and the Pathet Lao offensive soon scored significant advances. Then the American bombing began. Between 1965 and 1973, more than 2 million tons of bombs rained down upon the people of Laos, considerably more than the US had dropped on both Germany and Japan during the Second World War, albeit for a shorter period. For the first few years, the bombing was directed primarily at the provinces controlled by the Pathet Lao. Of the bombing, Fred Brentfin, a former American community worker in Laos, wrote, "Village after village was leveled, countless people buried alive by high explosives, or burnt alive by napalm and white phosphorus, or riddled by anti-personnel bomb pellets." Oh, like fragmentation, whatever, explode with 1,000 metal BBs to wide area. The United States has undertaken, said a Senate report, a large-scale air war over Laos to destroy the physical and social infrastructure of Pathet Lao-held areas and to interdict North Vietnamese infiltration. Throughout all this, there has been a policy of subterfuge and secrecy. Through such things as saturation bombing and the forced evacuation of population from enemy-held or threatened areas, we have helped to create untold agony for hundreds of thousands of villagers. Forced evacuation of population? Yeah, that's one way to phrase that. Euphemisms. The American military, however, kept proper records. AID could report to Congress that wounds suffered by civilian war casualties were as followed. Type 1. Type, soft tissue, 39%. Compound fracture, 30%. Amputation, 12%. Intra-abdominal, 10%. Intrathoracic, the chest, 3%. Intracranial, the head, 1%. 2. Location. Lower extremities, 60%. Upper extremities, 15%. Trunk, 18%. Head, 7%. There was no happy way out for the Laotian people. In October 1971, one could read in The Guardian of London. Although US officials deny it vehemently, ample evidence exists to confirm charges that the Mayo villages that do try to find their own way out of the war, even if it is simply by staying neutral and refusing to send their 13-year-olds to fight in the CIA army, are immediately denied American rice and transport and ultimately bombed by the US Air Force. Fledgling society that the United States was trying to make extinct, the CIA dropped millions of dollars in the forged the CIA dropped millions of dollars in forged Pathet Lao currency as well, in an attempt to wreck the economy, was one which Fred Brenfman described thus. The Pathet Lao rule over the Plain of Jars began in May 1964. What? Okay. The Pathet Lao rule over the Plain of Jars, begun in May 1964, brought its people into a post-colonial era. For the first time, they were taught pride in their country and people, instead of admiration for a foreign culture. Schooling and massive adult literacy campaigns were conducted in Laotian instead of French, and mild but thorough social revolution, ranging from land reform to greater equality for women, was instituted. Following on the heels of events in Vietnam, a ceasefire was arrived at in Laos in 1973, and yet another attempt at coalition government was undertaken. This one lasted until 1975, that's 2 years, when, after renewed fighting, the Pathet Lao took over full control of the country. Laos had become a land of nomads, without villages, without farms, a generation of refugees, hundreds of thousands dead, and many more maimed. When the US Air Force closed down its radio station, it signed off with a message: "Goodbye and see you next war." Thus it was that the worst of Washington's fears had come to pass. Oh, maybe you shouldn't have bombed them. That might have... Whatever. All of Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos had fallen to the communists. During the initial period of US involvement in Indochina in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles, Dwight Eisenhower, and other American officials regularly issued doomsday pronouncements of the type known as the domino theory, warning that if Indochina should fall, other nations in Asia would topple over as well. In one instance, President Eisenhower listed no less than Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Indonesia among the anticipated fallen dominoes. Such warnings were repeated periodically over the next decade by succeeding... Well, it sure would have been great if those dominoes fell, but no, not really. Such warnings were repeated periodically over the next decade by succeeding administrations and other supporters of US policy in Indochina as a key argument in defense of such policy. The fact that these ominous predictions turned out to have no basis in reality did not deter Washington officialdom from promulgating the same dogma up until the 90s about almost each new world trouble spot, testimony to their unshakable faith in the existence and interworkings of the international communist conspiracy. 22. Haiti, 1959 to 1963. A couple of hundred years after the initial slave revolts. Had to fuck them up again. No, okay. The Marines land again. Duvalier has performed an economic miracle, remarked a Haitian of his country's dictator. He has taught us to live without money, to eat without food, to live without life. And when Francois Papadoc Duvalier's voodoo magic wore thin, he could always count on the US Marines to continue his people's education. During the night of 12th to 13th August 1959, a boat landed on the northern coast of Haiti with a reported 30 men, Haitians and Cubans, and perhaps others aboard. The men had set sail from Cuba some 50 miles away. Their purpose was to overthrow the tyrannical Haitian government, a regime whose secret police, it was said, Oh, the plainclothes officers? No, a regime whose secret police, it was said, outnumbered its army. Okay. In short order, the raiding party, equipped with heavy weapons... Okay. In short order, the raiding party, equipped with heavy weapons, captured a small army post and began to recruit and arm villagers for the cause. The government reported that about 200 persons had joined them. Haitian exiles in Venezuela, in an apparently coordinated effort, broadcast appeals to the countrymen to aid the invaders. They set at 120 the amount of men who had landed in Haiti, although this appears to be an exaggeration. The initial reaction of the Duvalier government was one of panic, and the police began rounding up opposition sympathizers. It was at this point that the U.S. military mission in Haiti to train Duvalier's forces stepped in. The Americans instituted an air and sea reconnaissance to locate the rebels. Haitian soldiers, accompanied by U.S. Marines, were airlifted to the area and went into the field to do battle with them. 2 other U.S. Navy planes and a helicopter arrived from Puerto Rico. Another one of their dominated colonies. Hello, Ash. Welcome to here. Thought about doing an art stream today, but I don't feel like it. I also thought about gaming, but I don't feel like it. Just come back from China trip. I hope you had fun in China. See, I was like, okay. I hope it was Hun Hawar or whatever. Blah. Okay. According to the commander, Colonel Robert Debs Heinel Jr., the American Marines took part in the fighting, which lasted until 22nd August. The outcome was complete rout of the rebel forces. Information about the men who came from Cuba derives almost exclusively from the Haitian government and the American military mission. These sources claim that the raiding party was composed of about 30 men, and that with the exception of 1 or 2 Haitians who led them, they were all Cubans. Another report referred to in the New York Times stated that there were 10 Haitians and 2 Venezuelans amongst the 30 invaders. The latter ratio is probably closer to the truth, for there was a considerable number of Haitian exiles living in Cuba, many of whom had gained military experience during the recent Cuban Revolution. For obvious reasons of international politics and fighting incentive, such men were the most likely candidates to be parts of an invasion of their homeland. The Castro government readily admitted that the raiding party had come from Cuba, but denied that the government had known or approved of it. This claim would seem rather suspect were it not for the fact that the Cuban Coast Guard had thwarted a similar undertaking in April. The first members of the American military mission had arrived in Haiti in January, largely in response to another invasion attempt the previous July, originating probably in the Dominican Republic. That's the country that's directly to their... the directly to their eastern border. The only... They're an island, split down the middle. Regardless of all the horror stories about the Haitian regime, such as the one Colonel Heinel tells of his 12-year-old son being arrested when he was overheard expressing sympathy for a group of hungry peasants he saw, Duvalier was Washington's man. After all was said and done, he could be counted upon to keep his black nation, which was usually accorded the honor of being Latin America's poorest, from turning red. Heinel has recounted the instructions he received from a State Department Undersecretary in January. Colonel, the most important way you can support our objective in Haiti is to help keep Duvalier in power so he can serve out his full term in office, and maybe a little longer than that if everything works out. Yeehaw, giddy up, partner. The Kennedy administration, which came to power in January 1961, had little use for Papa Doc, and supported his overthrow as well as his... Duvalier, Papa Doc, and supported his overthrow, as well as his possible assassination. According to the later testimony of CIA official Walter Elder before a Senate investigating committee, the agency furnished arms to Haitian dissidents seeking to topple the dictator. Elder added that while the assassination of Duvalier was not contemplated, the arms were provided to help to help the dissidents take what measures were deemed necessary to replace the government. And it was realized, he said, that Duvalier might be killed in the course of the overthrow. But as Cuba increasingly became the United States' fuck-ass French word that I ain't never heard before, bête noire. Oh, just bête noire. You don't pronounce the E, maybe. Black Mirror. No, it's not the second episode of Black Mirror. Okay, let's put minus mirror. A person or thing strongly detested or avoided. It literally means black beast. Pet peeve? Is that? Let's see, word or black in French. Noir. Okay, yeah, that. On le baguette. Talking about to say hi, about to go to bed, and good luck book reads. Okay, have a good sleep. I will, and thank you for the water. And stretch. I did big sneeze. Okay, but as Cuba increasingly became the United States' least favorite guy of the CIA's great obsession, Washington's policy changed. Haiti's cooperation was needed for the success of U.S. efforts to have Cuba expelled from the Organization of American States in 1963. From that point on, Duvalier enjoyed the full diplomatic and economic support of the U.S. When the Haitian leader died on 12th of April 1971, American Ambassador Clinton Knox was the only diplomat present at the midnight swearing-in of 19-year-old Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier. Baby Doc, stop it. As the new president for life, who was to receive the same economic, political, and military support as had Papa Doc, with only the occasional hiccup of a protest from Washington when the level of repression became difficult to ignore. I'm getting distracted. Let me close that. Be gone. Okay. was to receive the same economic, political, and military support as had Papa Doc, with only the occasional hiccup of a protest from Washington when the level of repression became difficult to ignore. Keep Discord open so I can see my message me again. Guatemala. Oh, we're coming back to Guatemala. The long-awaited sequel. Damn. Excuse me. One good coup deserves another. In November 1960, as John F. Kennedy was preparing to succeed Dwight Eisenhower, the obsessive priority of American foreign policy, to invade Cuba, proceeded without pause. On the beaches and in the jungles of Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Florida, the Bay of Pigs invasion was being rehearsed. On the 13th of the month, 5 days after Kennedy's victory, Guatemalan military personnel broke out in armed rebellion against the government of General Miguel Vigores Fuentes, seizing 2 military bases in the port city of Puerto Barrios. Reports of the number of officers involved in the uprising vary from 45 to 120, the latter figure representing almost half the Guatemalan Army's officer corps. Wait, 120? Half of the Guatemalan Army's officer corps? That's like... Oh. Okay. The officers commanded as many as 2,000 troops, a significant percentage of the armed forces. Their goals, it later developed, were more nationalistic than ideological. The officers were fed up with the corruption of the Bigotas regime and in the army, and were particularly incensed about the use of their country by a foreign power as a springboard for an invasion of Cuba, some of them being admirers of Fidel Castro for his nationalist policies. One of the dissident officers later characterized the American training base in Guatemala as a shameful violation of our national sovereignty. And why was it permitted? Because our government is a puppet. The rebellion was crushed within a matter of days, reportedly by the sole power of the Guatemalan Air Force. Some years later, a different picture was to emerge. The rebels were a force to be reckoned with. The ease with which they had taken over the 2 garrisons and the real possibility of their mutiny spreading to other bases set alarms ringing at the CIA base. The CIA base, a large coffee plantation. That's the CIA base? Okay. CIA headquarters, unmarked office building in downtown New York. No, I mean, I guess that's usually how. It set alarms ringing at the CIA base, a large coffee plantation in a remote corner of southwestern Guatemala, where the agency and the U.S. Air Force were training the army of Cuban exiles who were to launch the attack upon their homeland. The CIA feared, and rightly so, that a new regime would send them, the Cubans, and the whole operation packing. In Washington, President Eisenhower ordered U.S. naval and air units to patrol the Caribbean coast and shoot if necessary to prevent any communist-led invasion of Guatemala or Nicaragua. Eisenhower, like Digoras, saw the hand of international communism, particularly Cuba, behind the uprising, although no evidence of this was ever presented. It was all most ironic in light of the fact that it was the conspiracy of the 2 leaders to overthrow Cuba. Oh. Star. Hello, adorable name and adorable Sona, nice to meet you. Hello, Maniac 4 Bricks. Nice to meet you too, thank you for the follow. I'm a little guy. No, I don't always use this model, but it's one of my more preferred ones now, I think. I rigged it with my bare hands. Sorry to interrupt. No, it's fine. I can interrupt myself with my own special power that I've honed in the mountains for years. But yeah, wait a minute. Oh, we're doing good today. Let's see. What was I saying? See. The hand of international communism. It was almost ironic in light of the fact that it was the conspiracy of the 2 leaders to overthrow Cuba that was one of the reasons for the uprising, and that the U.S. naval fleet ordered into action was deployed from Guantanamo Naval Bay in Cuba, an American military installation present in that country against the vociferous objections of the Cuban government. In Guatemala, meanwhile, The CIA decided upon a solution. In Guatemala, meanwhile, the CIA decided upon a solution to the dilemma that was both remarkably simple and close at hand. American and Cuban pilots took off from their training ground and bombed and strafed rebel headquarters outside Guatemala City and bombed the town and airfield of Puerto Barrios. Caught completely by surprise and defenseless against this superior force, the rebels' insurrection collapsed. Back at the coffee plantation, the CIA resumed the function which had been so rudely interrupted, the preparation for the overthrow of the Cuban government. No announcement about the bombings was made in Washington, nor did a report appear in the American press. The CIA actions were probably not widely known about in Guatemala either, but it became public knowledge that President Yiguras had asked Washington for the naval and air support and had even instructed the Guatemalan ambassador in Washington to get in touch immediately with Assistant Secretary of State, ASS, and Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Thomas Mann, to coordinate your action. Thus it was that the Guatemalan president, needing afterward to distance himself a little from so much Is that supposed to be like Yankee? Yankee? Variant spelling of Yankee, typically used in Latin American context. Okay, I've never seen that before. Needing afterward to distance himself a little from so much Yankee protection, was moved to state that countries like Guatemala are at a disadvantage because Cuba is a satellite of powerful Russia, but we are not a satellite of the United States. The final irony was that some of the dissident officers who went into hiding became more radicalized by their experience. During their revolt, they had spurned offers of support from some of the peasants, though this would necessarily have been very limited in any case, because fighting for social change was not at all what the officers had in mind at the time. But as fugitives thrown into greater contact with the peasants, they eventually came to be moved by the peasants' pressing need for land and for a way out of their wretched existence. In 1962, several of the officers were to emerge as leaders of a guerrilla movement, which incorporated November 13 as part of its name. In their opening statement, the guerrillas declared, "Democracy vanished from our country long ago. No people can live in a country where there is no democracy. That is why the demand for changes is mounting in our country. We can no longer carry on in this way. We must overthrow the Yiguras government and set up a government which represents human rights, seeks ways and means to save our country from its hardships, and pursues a serious, self-respecting foreign policy." A simple sentiment, stated even simpler, but as we shall see, a movement fated to come up against the wishes of the United States. For if Washington could casually do away with an elected government in Guatemala, as it had in 1954, it could be moved by a guerrilla army only as rocks by waves or the moon by howling wolves. Okay, I'm not even going to tell us what happened. I guess that means they got ultra exploded. 24. France, Algeria, 1960s. L'État chest la CIA. That's not how you pronounce the letters in French, but I don't know how to, so. When John F. Kennedy assumed office in January 1961, he was confronted with the CIA at the zenith of its power and credibility. In the agency's first 14 years, no formal congressional investigation of it had taken place, nor had any watchdog committee been established. 4 investigations of the CIA by independent task forces during this period had ensured that everything relating to things covert remained just that. With the exception of the U-2 incident the year before, the U-2 upper atmosphere spy plane above Russia, Soviet Union, with the exception of the U-2 incident the year before, no page 1 embarrassments, scandals, or known failures. What had received a measure of publicity, the coups in Guatemala and Iran, were widely regarded as CIA success stories. White House denials and a compliant media had kept the agency's misadventure in Indonesia in 1958 from the public scrutiny it deserved. It is probable that the CIA had more staff officers overseas under official and unofficial covers than the State Department, and this in addition to its countless paid agents. Often the CIA chief of station had been in a particular country longer than the American ambassador, had more money at his disposal, and exerted more influence. When it suited their purposes, agency officers would completely bypass the ambassador and normal protocol to deal directly with the country's head of state and other high officials. The CIA had its own military capabilities, including its own air force. For all intents and purposes, its own foreign service with, indeed, its own foreign policy, though never at cross purposes with fundamental U.S. Cold War, anti-communist ideology and goals. Seemingly without fear of exposure or condemnation, the agency felt free to carry out sundry Dr. Strangelove experiments involving control of the human mind. Oh, is that the MK Ultra? Teehee. And all manner of biochemical. If you don't know what that is, it's when they secretly tested on U.S. citizens and like grabbed them off the street or whatever, and subjected them to stuff. I don't remember exactly, but it was all kinds of like weird stuff to mind control experiments, quote unquote. Okay, at least I think that's what I understand of it. Let's see. Control the human mind and all manner of biochemical weapons, including the release of huge amounts of bacteria into the air in the United States, which resulted in much illness and a number of deaths. It was all very heady stuff for the officers of the CIA, playing their men's games with their boys' toys. They recognized scarcely any limitation upon their freedom of action. British colonial governors they were, and all the world was India. Then, in mid-April, came the disaster at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. The international repercussions had barely begun to subside when the agency was again catapulted into world headlines. On the 22nd of April, 4 French generals in Algeria seized power in an attempt to maintain the country's union with France. Let me look up Algeria real quick, because I'm a silly American who doesn't know where it is. Okay, it's in Northwest Africa. It's along. It has some of it bordering, or some of its border is on the coast. So it's like, I'll just pull it over here. There it is. Country in the Maghreb region of North Africa. The largest country in Africa, the 10th largest country in the world by land area. Capital, Algiers. Currency, Algerian dinar. Official languages, Arabic. Tamazight? I don't know. Population, 46 million. Okay. On 22nd April, 4 French generals in Algeria seized power in an attempt to maintain the country's union with France. The putsch, which held out but 4 days, was a direct confrontation with French President Charles de Gaulle, who had dramatically proclaimed a policy leading not to an Algeria governed from France, but to an Algerian Algeria. The next day, the leftist... I don't know if that's probably just ended up being neo-colonial, whatever. The next day, the leftist Italian newspaper, Il Paese, stated that it is not by chance that some people in Paris are accusing the American Secret Service, headed by Alan Dulles, of having participated in the plot of the 4 ultra generals. Whether Il Paese was the original source of this charge remains a mystery. Dulles himself later wrote that the Italian daily was one of the first to launch it, emphasis added. He expressed the opinion that this particular myth was a communist plant, pure and simple. Yeehaw, giddy up on out here, partner. I mean, skedaddle. Anyway, the New York Times reported that the rumors apparently began circulating by word of mouth on the day of the putsch. What is a putsch? You may wonder. A violent attempt to overthrow a government. A coup. Swiss-German word. The New York Times reported that the rumors apparently began circulating by word of mouth on the day of the putsch. A report echoed by the Washington Star, which added that some of the rumors were launched by minor officials at the Élysée Palace itself, who gave reporters to understand that the general's plot was backed by strongly anti-communist elements in the United States government and military services. Whatever its origins, the story spread rapidly around the world, and the French Foreign Office refused to refute the allegation. Le Monde asserted in a front-page editorial on 28 April that the behavior of the United States during the recent crisis was not particularly skillful. It seems established that American agents more or less encouraged Charles the leader of the putsch. President Kennedy, of course, knew nothing of all this. Reports from all sources were in agreement that if the CIA had indeed been involved in the putsch, it had been so for two reasons. One, the concern that if Algeria were granted independence, communists would soon come to power, being those in the ranks of the National Liberation Front, NLF, which had been fighting the French army in Algeria for several years, the Battle of Algiers. It was with the NLF that de Gaulle was expected to negotiate a settlement. Two, the hope that it would precipitate the downfall of de Gaulle, an end desired because the French president was a major stumbling block to U.S. aspirations concerning NATO. Among other things, he refused to incorporate French troops into an integrated military command, and he opposed exclusive American control over the alliance's nuclear weapons. By all accounts, it appears that the rebel officers had counted on support from important military and civilian quarters in France to extend the rebellion to the home country and overthrow de Gaulle. Oh, the rebel officers as in the U.S. sussed guys. Fanciful as this may sound, the fact remains that the French government took the possibility seriously. French Premier Michel Debré went on television to warn the nation of an imminent paratroop invasion of the Paris area and to urge mass opposition. Reaction in the American press to the allegations had an unmistakably motley quality. Washington Post, motley like patchwork, whatever. Washington Post columnist Marquis Childs said that the French were so shocked by the general's coup. At least I don't know. Motley's not really where you hear much. Not Morley. Motley. Incongruously varied in appearance or character, disparate. Of clothing, archaic, made of a variety of colors. Yeah, okay. Washington Post columnist Marquis Childs said that the French were so shocked by the general's coup that they had to find a scapegoat. At the same time, he quoted one of the highest French officials of the French government as saying, "Of course, your government, neither your State Department nor your president had anything to do with this, but when you have so many hundreds of agents in every part of the world, it is not to be wondered at that some of them should have got in touch with the generals in Algiers." Time magazine discounted the story, saying too that the United States was being made a scapegoat and that the CIA had become a favorite target in recent weeks. James Reston wrote in the New York Times that the CIA was involved in an embarrassing liaison with the anti-Gaullist officers who staged last week's insurrection in Algiers. The Bay of Pigs and Algerian events have increased the feeling in the White House that the CIA has gone beyond the bounds of an objective intelligence-gathering agency and has become the advocate of men and policies that have embarrassed the administration. However, C.L. Sulzberger, who had been the man at the New York Times closest to the CIA since its founding, stated flatly that no American in Algeria had to do with any insurrectional leader. No consular employee saw any rebel. A few days later, though, Secretary of State Dean Rusk disclosed that an emissary of the rebellious French generals had visited the U.S. consulate in Algiers to request aid, but it had been summarily rebuffed. The affair, wrote Sulzberger, was those Americans don't know how to do nothing but lie. The affair, wrote Sulzberger, was a deliberate effort to poison Franco-American relationships, begun in Moscow, but abetted by anti-American French officials. In Moscow, they mean the USSR. Anti-American French officials and naive persons in Washington. When one checks, one finds all this began in a Moscow Izvestia article, April 25th. This last, as we have seen, was incorrect. It started in Italia, mamma mia. Dean of American columnists, Walter Lippmann, who had seen de Gaulle in Paris shortly before the putsch, wrote, "The reason why the French government has not really exculpated the CIA, exonerated, proved their whatever, has not really exculpated the CIA of encouraging the Algerian rebel generals is that it was already so angry with the CIA for meddling in French internal politics. The French grievance, justified or not, has to do with recent French legislation for the French nuclear weapon and the alleged effort of CIA agents to interfere with that legislation. News Newsweek repeated the claim that it was French officials who had been the main sources of the rumors in the first place. When challenged by the American administration, the French denied their authorship and tended to soften the charges. Excuse me. Some French officials eventually declared the matter to be closed, though they still failed to explicitly rule out the allegations about American involvement. In early May 1961, L'Express, the widely read French liberal weekly, published what was perhaps the first detailed account of the mysterious affair. Their Algerian correspondent, Claude Crieff, reported, both in Paris and Washington, the facts are now known, though they will never be publicly admitted. In private, the highest French personalities make no secret of it. What they say is this: the CIA played a direct part in the Algiers coup, and certainly weighed heavily on the decision taken by ex-General Charles to start his putsch. Not long before, Charles had... I'm not going to try and pronounce it Frenchly or whatever. Charles had held the position of NATO Commander-in-Chief, Allied Forces, Central Europe, as a result of which he had been in daily contact with U.S. military officers. Crieff wrote that certain American officials in NATO and the Pentagon had encouraged Charles, and that the general had several meetings with CIA officers who told him that to get rid of de Gaulle would render the free world a great service. Free world as in free market, free to exploit, free to... No. Crieff noted that Charles, despite an overweening ambition, was very cautious and serious-minded. All the people who know him well are deeply convinced that he had been encouraged by the CIA to go ahead. At a unforgettable luncheon, at a luncheon in Washington the previous year, Jacques Soustelle, the former Governor General of Algeria, who had made public his disagreement with de Gaulle's Algeria policy, had met with CIA officials, including Richard Bissell, head of covert operations. Soustelle convinced the agency officials, according to Crieff, that Algeria would become, through de Gaulle's blundering, a Soviet base. This luncheon became something of a cause célèbre. Cause for self. I mean, I'll just look it up. This one seems more obvious. Nope. A cause célèbre. Oh. Is an issue or incident arousing widespread controversy outside campaigning and heated public debate. The term is sometimes used positively for celebrated legal cases for their precedent value, and more often negatively for infamous ones, whether for scale, outrage, scandal, or conspiracy theories. Became something of an incident arousing widespread controversy in the speculation concerning the CIA's possible role. The New York Times and others reported that it had been given by the agency for Soustelle. U.S. officials, however, insisted that the luncheon had been arranged by someone at the French embassy at Soustelle's request. This French official, they said, had been present throughout the meeting, and thus there could have been no dark conspiracy. Why the French embassy would host a luncheon for a prominent and bitter foe of de Gaulle, a man who only 2 months earlier had been kicked out of de Gaulle's cabinet for his ultra-sympathies, was not explained, nor for that matter why in protocol-minded Washington of all places the CIA would attend. In any event, it seemed somewhat fatuous to imply that this was the only chance Soustelle and the CIA had to talk during his stay in the United States, which lasted more than a week. A clandestine meeting in Madrid also received wide currency within the controversy. Oh, that's in Spain, right? Yeah. Capital of Spain? Okay. Crieff dates it 12th April 1961 and describes it as a meeting of various foreign agents, including members of the CIA and the Algiers conspirators, who disclosed their plans to the CIA men. The Americans were reported to have angrily complained that de Gaulle's policy was paralyzing NATO and rendering the defense of Europe impossible, and assured the generals that if they and their followers succeeded, Washington would recognize the new Algerian government within 48 hours. 48 hours. It may well be that the French government did have evidence of the CIA's complicity, but in the unnatural world of international diplomacy, this would not necessarily lead to an unambiguous public announcement. Such a move could result in an open confrontation between France and the United States, a predicament both sides could be expected to take pains to avoid. Moreover, it might put the French in the position of having to do something about it, and what could they do? Breaking relations with the United States was not a realistic option. Neither were the French in any position to retaliate economically or militarily. But French leaders were too angry to simply let the matter pass into obscurity. Thus, to complete the hypothetical scenario, they took the backdoor approach with all its shortcomings. In a similar vein, the United States knew that the Russians, aka the Soviet Union, for at least 1 year, were intercepting telephone calls in the US of government and congressional officials, but said nothing publicly because it was unable to end the practice for technical reasons. And this concerned an enemy, not an ally. I just specify when they say Russians because the USSR is a different entity from the Russian Federation, and the USSR doesn't exist anymore. Between 1958 and the middle of the 1960s, there occurred some 30 serious assassination attempts upon the life of Charles de Gaulle, in addition to any number of planned attempts which didn't advance much beyond the planning stage. A world record for 30 assassination attempts. A world record for a head of state, it is said. In at least one of the attempts, the CIA may have been a co-conspirator against the French president. By the mid-1960s, differences between de Gaulle and Washington concerning NATO had almost reached the breaking point. In February 1966, he gave NATO and the United States a deadline to either place the military bases in France under French control or dismantle them. You know, this was called France/Algeria chapter, but it's a lot more on France right now, I think. In 1975, the Chicago Tribune featured a front-page story which read in part, "Congressional leaders have been told of Central Intelligence Agency involvement in a plot by French dissidents to assassinate the late French President Charles de Gaulle. Within the last 2 weeks, a CIA representative disclosed sketchy details of the scheme. Sometime in the mid-1960s, probably in 65 or 66, dissidents in the de Gaulle government are said to have made contact with the CIA to seek help in a plot to murder the French leader. Which party instigated the contact was not clear. According to the CIA briefing officer, discussions were held on how best to eliminate de Gaulle, who by then had become a thorn in the side of the Johnson administration because of his ouster of American military bases from French soil, and his demands that United States forces be withdrawn from the Indochina War. Thus, the following plan is said to have evolved after discussions between CIA personnel and the dissident French. There is, however, no evidence the plot got beyond the talking stage. A hired assassin, armed with a poison ring, was to be slipped into a crowd of old soldiers of France, when General de Gaulle was to be the host at a reception for them. The killer would make his appearance late in the day, when it could be presumed de Gaulle's hand would be weary, and perhaps even numb from shaking hundreds of hands. The assassin would clasp the general's hand in lethal friendship, and de Gaulle would fail to detect the tiny pinprick of poison as it penetrated his flesh. The executioner would stroll off to become lost in the crowd as the poison began coursing through de Gaulle's veins, either to his heart or brain, depending on the deadly poison used. How quickly death would come was not divulged, if that was even discussed at the time. In the outline presented to the congressional leaders, there is no hint of what the CIA's actual role might have been had the plot reached fruition. Take a sip of water real quick. That was a funny noise. I think I need more water than that, but I wake up dehydrated a lot, I think. Or at least, that's been happening more often than usual. Perfect. Let's see. The dissidents involved in the alleged plot were embittered French army officers and former Algerian settlers, who still bore deep resentment toward de Gaulle for having sold out French honor by his retreat from the North African colony. There was no mention in the reported CIA testimony about any involvement of Lyndon B. Johnson, although it was well known that there was no love lost between Johnson and de Gaulle. Man. Making me look this shit up. No love lost. They were making out? What is the phrase "no love lost"? You say there's no love lost between two groups, you mean that they do not like each other at all. Okay. It was well known that they didn't like each other. The French leader was firmly convinced that the United States was behind the failure. The French leader was firmly convinced the United States was behind the failure of his trip to South America in 1964. He believed that the CIA had used its network of agents in South America to prevent a big turnout of crowds. There is some evidence to indicate that the general was not just paranoid. In 1970, Dr. Alfred Stepan, a professor of political science at Yale, testified before Congress about his experience in South America in 1964 when he was a journalist for The Economist. When de Gaulle was going to make his trip to Latin America, many of the Latin Americans interviewed, officers of various embassies, said that they were under very real pressure by various American groups not to be very warm towards de Gaulle, because we consider Latin America within the United States area of influence. After the appearance of the Chicago Tribune story, CIA Director William Colby confirmed that foreigners had approached the agency with a plot to kill de Gaulle. The agency rejected the idea. Oh, we're so fine and non-killification guys. No, the agency rejected the idea, Colby said, but he did not know if the French government had been advised of the plot. It is not clear whether the incident referred to by Colby was related to the one discussed in the Tribune. In the early evening of Monday, 9th November 1970, Charles de Gaulle died peacefully at the age of 80, sitting in his armchair watching a sentimental television serial called Nano. 25, Ecuador, 1960-1963. Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot about Algeria in there. Although I guess, he cameoed. Oh. Okay, Ecuador, 1960-63. A textbook of dirty tricks. The Guinness Book of World Records. The Guinness Book of World Records, the one by the... Was it the beer company? No. Yeah. Yeah, they're a brewery. Okay, if the Guinness Book of World Records included a category for cynicism, one could suggest the CIA's creation of leftist organizations which condemned poverty, disease, illiteracy, capitalism in the United States in order to attract committed... Oh, okay. In order to attract committed militants and their money away from legitimate leftist organizations. Yeah, I think that would hit the category for cynicism. It would be a big winner. The tiny nation of Ecuador in the early 1960s was, as it remains today, a classic of banana republic underdevelopment. Virtually at the bottom of the economic heap in South America, a society in which 1% of the population received an income comparable to United States upper-class standards, while 2/3 of the people had an average family income of about $10 per month. People simply outside the money economy, with little social integration or participation in the national life, a tale told many times in Latin America. In September 1960, a new government headed by José María Velasco Ibarra came to power. Velasco had won a decisive electoral victory, running on a vaguely liberal, populist, something-for-everyone platform. He was no Fidel Castro. He was not even a socialist, but he earned the wrath of the U.S. State Department and the CIA by his unyielding opposition to the two stated priorities of American policy in Ecuador: breaking relations with Cuba and clamping down hard on activists of the Communist Party and those to their left. Over the next 3 years, in pursuit of those goals, the CIA left as little as possible to chance. A veritable textbook on covert subversion techniques unfolded. In its pages could be found the following, based upon the experiences of Philip Agee, a CIA officer who spent this period in Ecuador. Almost all political organizations of significance, from the far left to the far right, were infiltrated, often at the highest levels. A real COINTELPRO moment. Oh, that was the FBI, my bad. The FBI did COINTELPRO. That was the local. The domestic version. Amongst other reasons, the left was infiltrated to channel young radicals away from support to Cuba and from anti-Americanism. The right to instigate and coordinate activities along the lines of CIA priorities. If at a point in time there was no organization that appeared well suited to serve a particular need, then one would be created. Or ugh, my throat is being uncooperative today. Or a new group of concerned citizens would appear, fronted with noted personalities, which might place a series of notices in leading newspapers denouncing the penetration of the government, denouncing the penetration of the government by the extreme left and demanding a break with Cuba. Or one of the noted personalities would deliver a speech prepared by the CIA, and then a newspaper editor or a well-known columnist would praise it, both gentlemen being on the CIA payroll. Some of these fronts had an actual existence. For others, even their existence was phony. On one occasion, the CIA officer who had created the non-existent Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Front was surprised to read in his morning paper that a real organization with that name had been founded. No. He changed the name of his organization to Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Action. Okay. Wooing the working class came in for special emphasis. An alphabet soup of labor organizations, sometimes hardly more than names on stationery, were created, altered, combined, liquidated, and new ones created again, in an almost frenzied attempt to find the right combination to compete with existing left-oriented unions and take national leadership away from them. Union leaders were invited to attend various classes conducted by the CIA in Ecuador or in the United States, all expenses paid, in order to impart to them the dangers of communism to the union movement and to select potential agents. This effort was not without its irony either. CIA agents would sometimes jealously vie with each other for the best positions in these CIA-created labor organizations. And at times, Ecuadorian organizations would meet in international conferences with CIA labor fronts from other countries, with almost all of the participants blissfully unaware of who was who or what was what. In Ecuador, as throughout most of Latin America, is that like when the undercover officer, it's like when the guy goes to buy drugs from a dealer, and then the guy buying drugs was an undercover officer, and then the guy selling them was an undercover officer, and then they arrest each other, and okay. In Ecuador, as throughout most of Latin America, the agency planted phony anti-communist news items in cooperating newspapers. Oops. These items would then be picked up by other CIA stations in Latin America and disseminated through a CIA-owned news agency, a CIA-owned radio station, or through countless journalists being paid on a piecework basis, in addition to the item being picked up unwittingly by other media, including those in the United States. Anti-communist propaganda and news distortion, often of the most far-fetched variety, written in CIA offices, would also appear in Latin American newspapers as unsigned editorials of the papers themselves. In virtually every department of the Ecuadorian government could be found men occupying positions high and low who collaborated with the CIA for money and or their own particular motivation. At one point, the agency could count amongst this number the men who were second and third in power in the country. The VP? Damn. These government agents would receive the benefits of information obtained by the CIA through electronic eavesdropping or other means, enabling them to gain prestige and promotion, or consolidate their current position in the rough and tumble of Ecuadorian politics. A high-ranking minister of leftist tendencies, on the other hand, would be the target of a steady stream of negative propaganda from any or all sources in the CIA arsenal. Staged demonstrations against him would further increase the pressure on the president to replace him. The Postmaster General, along with other post office employees, all members in good standing of the CIA payroll club, regularly sent mail arriving from Cuba and the Soviet bloc to the agency for its perusal, while customs officials and the director of immigration kept the agency posted on who went to or came from Cuba. When a particularly suitable target returned from Cuba, it would be searched at the airport and documents prepared by the CIA would be found on him. These documents, publicized as much as possible, might include instructions on how to intensify hatred between classes, or some provocative language designed to cause a split in Communist Party ranks. Generally, the documents verified the worst fears of the public about communist plans to take over Ecuador under the masterminding of Cuba or the Soviet Union. At the same time, perhaps implicating an... Damn, are you saying that this international communist conspiracy was made up by the CIA? Color me surprised. See, the worst fears of the public about communist plans to take over Ecuador under the masterminding of Cuba or the Soviet Union. At the same time, perhaps implicating an important Ecuadorian leftist whose head the agency was after. Similar revelations, staged by CIA stations elsewhere in Latin America, would be publicized in Ecuador as a warning that Ecuador is next. Agency financing of conservative groups in a quasi-religious campaign against Cuba and atheistic communism helped to seriously weaken President Velasco's power among the poor, primarily Indians who had voted overwhelmingly for him, but who were even more deeply committed to their religion. If the CIA wished to know how the president was reacting to this campaign, it need only turn to his physician, its agent, Dr. Felipe Oval, who would report that his patient was feeling considerable strain as a result. Damn, even the doctor's in on this? That's so messed up, bro. CIA agents would bomb churches or right-wing organizations and make it appear to be the work of leftists. They would march in left-wing parades, displaying signs and shouting slogans of a very provocative, anti-military nature, designed to antagonize the armed forces and hasten a coup. The agency did not always get away clean with its dirty tricks. So, wait, hold on. Alright, President Velasco was like, he was just like, kind of a liberal. But he did some policies that the CIA didn't like, so that's why they wanted to. Okay. Hasten a coup. The agency did not always get away clean with its dirty tricks. During the election campaign on 19th March 1960, two senior colonels, who were the CIA's main liaison agents within the National Police, participated in a riot aimed at disrupting a Velasco demonstration. Agency Officer Bob Weatherwax. That is the most yeehaw-ass name that we've seen so far. No, Agency Officer Bob Weatherwax was in the forefront, directing the police during the riot in which 5 Velasco supporters were killed and many wounded. When Velasco took office, he had the 2 colonels arrested, and Weatherwax was asked to leave the country. CIA-supported activities were carried out without the knowledge of the American ambassador. Oh, I thought the American In this particular case, the American ambassador was not CIA. No, CIA-supported activities were carried out without the knowledge of the American ambassador. When the Cuban embassy publicly charged the agency with involvement in various... When the Cuban embassy publicly charged the agency with involvement in various anti-Cuban activities, the American ambassador issued a statement that had everyone in the CIA station smiling. Stated the ambassador, "The only agents in Ecuador who are paid by the United States are the technicians invited by the Ecuadorian government to contribute to raising the living standards of the Ecuadorian people." Finally, in November 1961, the military acted. Velasco was forced to resign and was replaced by Vice President Carlos Julio Arosemena. There were at this time 2 prime candidates for the vice presidency. One was the vice president of the Senate, a CIA agent. The other was the rectum. The other was the rector of Central University, a political moderate. What is a rector? In the Church of England. No, it's not the Church of England. The head of certain universities, colleges, and schools. The day that Congress convened to make their choice, The day that Congress convened to make their choice, a notice appeared in a morning paper announcing support for the rector by the Communist Party and a militant leftist youth organization. The notice had been placed by a columnist for the newspaper who was the principal propaganda agent for the CIA's Quito station. The rector was compromised rather badly. The denials came too late, and the CIA man won. His agency salary was increased from $700 to $1,000 a month. 1961. Inflation calculator. America. $1961. $10,781 in 2025. Salary, is that $10,000 a month? Is that? Oh, I don't know. I don't speak salary. Salary to hourly calculator. $10,000 monthly. $57 an hour. Okay, whatever. Shmimmy, man. Erosamana soon proved no more acceptable to the CIA than Velasco. All operations continued, particularly the campaign to break relations with Cuba, which Erosamana steadfastly refused to do. I just wanted to check that because I was like, that doesn't sound like a whole lot. Are they paying... Do they pay their foreign agents peanuts because they don't have to pay them any more than whatever? But I guess inflation or whatever. Inflation, which is some capitalist magic, not really based on anything in reality. No, shmimmer. So all operations continued. Excuse me. Ah. Do partner.
Howdy do.
What brings you around these parts?
Rest. Like an hour and a half drive. So much driving. Grr. How's your stream?
Stream goes. Like that. Wow. Tuka. All operations continue, particularly the campaign to break relations with Cuba, which Arosamana steadfastly refused to do. The deadlock was broken in March 1962 when a military garrison led by Colonel Aurelio Naranjo gave Arosamana 72 hours to send the Cubans packing and fire the leftist Minister of Labor. There is no need to point out here who Naranjo's financial benefactor was. Arosamana complied with the ultimatum, booting out the Czech and Polish delegations as well at the behest of the new cabinet which had been forced upon him. I'm gonna go grab Muddy. Excuse me. Okay. Probably gonna just read a couple more chapters and then do a thing with Muddy. Another short reading stream? It's possible. So at the CIA station in Quito, there was a champagne victory celebration. Elsewhere in Ecuador, people angry about the military's domination and desperate about their own lives took to arms. But on this occasion, like others, it amounted to naught. A small band of people, poorly armed and trained, infiltrated by agents, their every move known in advance, confronted by a battalion of paratroopers, superbly armed and trained by the United States. That was in the field. In press reports, the small band Oh, okay. As in, that was the reality on the ground. In press reports, the small band grew to hundreds, armed not only to the teeth, but with weapons from outside the country, read Cuba, and the whole operation very carefully planned at the Communist Party Congress the month before. On 11th July 1963, the presidential palace in Quito was surrounded by tanks and troops. Arroz Semana was out. A junta was in. Military junta. Junta. Military political group that rules the country after taking power by force. Means committee or something. Their first act was to outlaw communism. Communists and other extreme leftists were rounded up and jailed. The rest... Oh, that was a very late reply. Excuse me. China is very fun. It's my first time in Beijing. Glad you had fun. I want to visit China again sometime, but it is far distant thing for champs. Also, if I wanted to visit my relatives, I'd have to ask my mom where they're living right now. Or for their contacts, at least, or whatever. I have to add my relatives on WeChat. Oh no. Okay. See, the junta. The first act was to outlaw communism. Communists and other extreme leftists were rounded up and jailed. The arrests campaign being facilitated by data from the CIA's Subversive Control Watch List. Oh, huh. That. I don't know why they didn't go earlier. Also, I think I will clean that up and compact it into one paragraph later. Oh. I also go to Shanghai, Hangzhou, Suzhou, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. How? Oh. Yeah. Well, I'm jelly. Jealous. Kef, a little bit. Let's see. CIA's Subversive Control Watch List. Standard at many agency stations, this list would include not only the subject name, but the names and addresses of his relatives and friends and the places he frequented. Anything to aid in tracking him down when the time came. Yeah. Civil liberties were suspended. The 1964 elections cancelled. Another tale told many times in Latin America. And during these 3 years, what were the American people told about this witch brew of covert actions carried out, supposedly in their name? Very little, if anything, if the New York Times is any index. Not once during the entire period, up to and including the coup, was any indication given in any article or editorial on Ecuador that the CIA or any other arm of the US government had played any role whatever in any event which had occurred in that country. This is the way the writings read, even if one looks back at them with the advantage of knowledge and hindsight and reads between the lines. There is a solitary exception. Following the coup, we find a tiny announcement on the very bottom of page 20. Page 20 of...
Keep going until I let you know that I'm done. And then finish that chapter.
Okay.
It could be like an hour or more.
Okay. How long you haven't gone to China? Probably like 10 years. No, maybe more like 15. Last time I was in I think I was in middle school. And normally, or previously, the whole family, no, it's just, my parents, me, and my sister, so that's 4 people total. It was, the first few times, it was all 4 of us. The last time that I visited China, it was just me and my sister. And that was because, my parents said it'd be cheaper if just the 2 of us went. Maybe it was also supposed to be an exercise and responsibility or something, I don't know. see. There is a solitary exception. Following the coup, we find a tiny announcement on the very bottom of page 20 that Havana Radio had accused the United States of instigating the military takeover. The Cuban government had been making public charges about American activities in Ecuador regularly, but this was the first one to make the New York Times. The question must be asked, why were these charges deemed unworthy of reporting or comment, let alone investigation? Because evil, scary communist country, TMTM. 26. The Congo. 1960, 1964. Oh, my nose is getting a little itchy again. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba. I'm going to look up where the Congo is, even though I know it's in, like, south or southeast of Africa. I'm just going to check exactly where it is. Because maybe I'm wrong, actually. No, actually, it's kind of larger than I thought. Hold on. Republic of the Congo? Let me look up. Republic of Congo versus Democratic Republic of Congo. Oh. Okay, well, I didn't know that. Let me just check to make sure. Let's see. This article is about the larger country. For the smaller neighboring country, see Republic of the Congo. And the other one says it's about the smaller country. For the larger neighboring country, formerly known as Zaire, see Democratic Republic of the Congo. Republic of the Congo. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Republic of the Congo. And it is... Oh, that's a little hard to see. There's Republic of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's like, yeah. Alright. Within days of its independence from Belgium on 30th June 1960, the land long known as the Belgian Congo, and later as Zaire, was engulfed in strife and chaos, as multiple individuals, tribes, and political groups struggled for dominance or independence. For the next several years, the world press chronicled the train of Congolese governments, the endless confusion of personalities and conspiracies. Exotic place names like Stanleyville and Leopoldville, shocking stories of your...
One Smith.
Oh. Hi, Muddy. Thank you for the resub. Hope you're enjoying your noodles. I think those were noodles. I'm not really... Sometimes things happen around me, and it's all blurry. No, okay. Stanleyville and Leopoldville, like King Leopold II. Shocking stories of European hostages and white mercenaries. The brutality and the violence from all quarters with its racist overtones. Into this disorder, the Western powers were naturally drawn, principally Belgium, to protect its vast mineral investments, and the United States, mindful of the fabulous wealth as well, and obsessed as usual with fighting communism. Successive American administrations of Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, looking through Cold War binoculars, perceived an east-west battleground. The CIA station in the Congo cabled Washington in August that embassy and station believe Congo experiencing classic communist effort to take over government. CIA Director Alan Dulles warned of a communist takeover of the Congo with disastrous consequences for the interests of the free world. At the same time, Dulles authorized a cash program fund of up to $100,000 to replace the existing government of Patrice Lumumba with a pro-Western group. I'm going to assume, or in nowadays dollars, that'd be more like $1 million. $1 million buckaroos. It's not known what criteria the CIA applied to determine that Lumumba's government was going communist, but we do know how the Washington Post arrived at the same conclusion. Western diplomats see the part of the Congo controlled by volatile Premier Patrice Lumumba sliding slowly. Oh, yeah, I gotta do my American voice now. Sliding slowly but surely into the communist bloc. Apart from the fevered activity of communist bloc nations here, the pattern of events is becoming apparent to students of communist policy. Premier Lumumba's startling changes of position, his open challenge of the United Nations and Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, his constant agitation of the largely illiterate Congolese can be explained in no other way, veteran observers say. Years later, Undersecretary of State C. Douglas Dillon told a Senate investigating committee, the Church Committee, that the National Security Council and President Eisenhower had believed in 1960 that Lumumba was a very difficult, if not impossible, person to deal with and was dangerous to the peace and safety of the world. The statement moved author Jonathan Whitney to observe, how far beyond the dreams of a barefoot jungle postal clerk in 1956, that in a few short years he would be dangerous to the peace and safety of the world. The perception seems insane, particularly coming from the National Security Council, which really does have the power to end all human life within hours. Talking about nukes, presumably. Patrice Lumumba became the Congo's first prime minister after his party received a plurality of the votes in national elections. He called for the nation's economic as well as political liberation and did not shy away from contact with socialist countries. At the Independence Day ceremonies, he probably managed to alienate all the attending foreign dignitaries with his speech, which read in part, "Our lot was 80 years of colonial rule. We have known tiring labor exacted in exchange for salary which did not allow us to satisfy our hunger. We have known ironies, insults, blows which we have had to endure morning, noon, and night because we were Negroes. We have known that the law was never the same, depending on whether it concerned a white or a Negro. We have known the atrocious sufferings of those banished for political opinions or religious beliefs. We have known that there were magnificent houses for the whites in the cities and tumble-down straw huts for the Negroes. In 1960, it must be borne in mind, this was indeed radical and inflammatory language in such a setting." Oh, he made all the white boys mad. On 11th July, the province of Katanga, home to the bulk of the Congo's copper, cobalt, uranium, gold, and other mineral wealth, announced that it was seceding. Belgium, the principal owner of this fabulous wealth, never had any intention of giving up real control of the country, and it now supported the move for Katanga's independence, perceiving the advantage of having its investments housed in their own little country, not accountable to nor paying taxes to the central government in Leopoldville. Damn, did they really keep the name Leopoldville, even though they... Anyway, Katanga, moreover, was led by Moise Tshombe, a man eminently accommodating to and respectful of whites and their investments. The Eisenhower administration supported the Belgian military intervention on behalf of Katanga. Indeed, the American embassy had previously requested such intervention. Influencing this policy, in addition to Washington's ideological aversion to Lumumba, was the fact that a number of prominent administration officials had financial ties to the Katanga wealth. The Belgian intervention, which was a very violent one, was denounced harshly by the Soviet Union, as well as many countries from the Afro-Asian bloc, leading the UN Security Council on the 14th to authorize the withdrawal of Belgian troops and their replacement by a United Nations military force. This was fine with the United States, for the UN under Dag Hammarskjöld was very closely allied to Washington. The UN officials who led the Congo operation were Americans, in secret collaboration with the State Department and in exclusion of the Soviet bloc. The latter's citizens who worked at the UN Secretariat were kept from seeing the Congo cables. Oh, yeah, because the UN Security Council did also have Soviets in it. I don't know. Hammarskjöld himself was quite hostile toward Lumumba. The UN force entered Katanga province and replaced the Belgian troops, but made no effort to end the secession. Unable to put down this uprising on his own, as well as one in another province, Lumumba had appealed to the United Nations as well as the United States to supply him with transport for his troops. Oh, but he didn't know what kind of game was being played, and then he exploded. When they both refused, he turned to the Soviet Union for aid and received it, though military success still eluded him. The Congo was in turmoil in many places. In the midst of it, on 5th of September, President Joseph Kasavubu suddenly dismissed Lumumba as prime minister. President versus prime. What's the deal with? I thought the prime minister was like. Okay. President versus prime minister in a country with both. No, guys, they're not the same thing. Oh, splat. Semi-presidential system or dual executive system is a system in which a president exists alongside a prime minister and a cabinet. Limit the dictatorial tendencies as seen in some countries of the pure presidential system. Well, like the United States. No. Whatever. Crunch you. See, the Congo was in turmoil in many places. In the midst of it, on 5th of September, President Joseph Kasavubu suddenly dismissed Lumumba as prime minister, a step of very debatable legality, taken with much American encouragement and assistance, as Kasavubu sat at the feet of the CIA men. Oh, he was kissing their boots. The action was taken, said the church committee later, despite the strong support for Lumumba in the Congolese parliament. During the early 1960s, let's see. During the early 1960s, according to a highly placed CIA executive, the agency regularly bought and sold Congolese politicians. U.S. diplomatic sources subsequently confirmed that Kasavubu was among the recipients. Hammarskjöld publicly endorsed the dismissal before the Security Council, and when Lumumba tried to broadcast his case to the Congolese people, UN forces closed the radio station. Instead, he appeared before the legislature, and by dint of his formidable powers of speech, both houses of parliament voted to reaffirm him as prime minister. But he could taste the fruits of his victory for only a few days, for on the 14th, army strongman Joseph Mobutu took power in a military coup designed by the United States. Even during this period, with Lumumba not really in power, CIA and high administration officials continued to view him as a threat. His talents and dynamism appeared to be the overriding factor in re-establishing his position each time it seems half lost. Lumumba was a spellbinding orator with the ability to stir masses of people to action. If he started to talk to a battalion of the Congolese army, he probably would have had them in the palm of his hand in 5 minutes. In late September, the CIA sent one of its scientists, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, to the Congo carrying a lethal biological material, a virus, specifically intended for use in Lumumba's assassination. The virus, which was supposed to produce a fatal disease indigenous to the Congo area of Africa, was transported via a diplomatic pouch. In 1975, the Church Committee went on record with the conclusion that Alan Dulles had ordered Lumumba's assassination as an urgent and prime objective, Dulles' words. After hearing the testimony of several officials who believed that the order to kill the African leader had emanated originally from President Eisenhower, the committee decided that there was a reasonable inference that this was indeed the case. As matters evolved in the Congo, the virus was never used, for the CIA's Congo station was unable to come up with a secure enough agent with the right access to Lumumba before the potency of the biological material was no longer reliable. The Church Committee observed, however, that the CIA station in Leopoldville continued to maintain close contact with Congolese who expressed a desire to assassinate Lumumba. CIA officers encouraged and offered to aid these Congolese in their efforts against Lumumba, although there is no evidence that aid was ever provided for the specific purpose of assassination. Fearing for his life, Lumumba was on the run. For a while, he was protected from Mobutu by the United Nations, which, under considerable international pressure, had been forced to put some distance between itself and Washington. But on 1st of December, Lumumba was taken into custody by Mobutu's troops. A 28th of November CIA cable indicates that the agency was involved in tracking down the charismatic Congo leader. The cable spoke of the CIA station working with the Congolese government to get the roads blocked and troops alerted to close a possible escape route of Lumumba's. The United States had also been involved in the takeover of government by Mobutu, whom author and CIA confidant Andrew Tully described as having been discovered by the CIA. Mobutu detained Lumumba until 17th January 1961, when he transferred his prisoner into the hands of Moise Tshombe of Katanga province, Lumumba's bitter enemy. Lumumba was assassinated the same day. In 1978, former CIA Africa specialist John Stockwell related in his book how a ranking agency officer had told him of driving around with Lumumba's body in the trunk of his car, trying to decide what to do with it. What he did do with it has not yet been made public. During the period of Lumumba's imprisonment, U.S. diplomats in the Congo were pursuing a policy of deploring his beatings and trying to secure humane treatment for him, albeit due to considerations of international opinion and not from tender feelings toward him. The immediate and the long-term effect of Lumumba's murder was to make him the martyr and symbol of anti-imperialism all over Africa and elsewhere in the Third World, which such American officials had feared. Even Mobutu later felt compelled to build a memorial to his victim. Without a clear-cut communist enemy like Lumumba, the Kennedy administration, which came to power on 20th January 1961, was very divided on the Katanga question. Although the United States wound up supporting, in the name of Congolese stability, the UN military operation in the summer to suppress the secession, Tshombe had outspoken support in the U.S. Congress. Excuse me. Although the United States wound up supporting the UN military operation in the summer to suppress the secession, Tshombe had outspoken support in the U.S. Congress, and sentiment among officials at the State Department and the White House mirrored this division. The sundry economic and diplomatic ties of these officials appear to have been more diverse and contradictory than under the Eisenhower administration, and this is reflected in the lack of unified policy. However, according to Kennedy advisor and biographer Arthur Schlesinger, opinions on both sides of the issue were expressed in terms of hindering supposed malevolent Soviet/communist designs in the Congo. In an even more marked policy division, U.S. Air Force C-130s were flying Congolese troops and supplies against the Katangese rebels, while at the same time the CIA and its covert colleagues in the Pentagon were putting together an air armada of heavy transport aircraft along with mercenary units to aid the very same rebels. This marked at least the third instance of the CIA acting in direct military opposition to another arm of the U.S. government. Wow. Washington officials were more in unison when dealing with another prominent leftist, Antoine Gizinga, who had been vice prime minister under Lumumba. Activate laser beams. There's a little shrimp that appeared in chat. Robot shrimp. Okay. Washington officials were more in unison with dealing with another prominent leftist, Antoine Gizinga, who had been vice prime minister under Lumumba. Following the latter's dismissal, according to the Church Committee, the CIA station chief in the Congo, Lawrence Devlin, urged a key Congolese leader, presumably Mobutu, to arrest or undertake a more permanent disposal of Lumumba, Gizinga, and Mulele. Pierre Mulele was another Lumumba lieutenant. Gizinga was in fact arrested shortly after Mobutu took power, but a UN contingent from Ghana, whose leader, Kwame Nkrumah, was Lumumba's ally, intervened and freed him. In the continuous musical chairs game of Congolese politics, the 1st of August 1961 found Gizenga as the vice prime minister under one Cyrili Adula. By the end of the month, Gizenga was as well, and simultaneously, the leader of a rebel force that had set up a regime in the Stanleyville area which it proclaimed as the legitimate government of the entire Congo. He fancied himself the political and spiritual successor to Lumumba. The Soviet Union may have believed Gizenga, for apparently they were sending him arms and money, using Sudan, which borders the Congo in the north, as a conduit. When the CIA learned that a Czech ship was bound for Sudan with a cargo of guns, When the CIA learned that a Czech ship was bound for Sudan with a cargo of guns disguised as Red Cross packages for refugee relief in the Congo, the agency turned to its most practiced art, bribery, to persuade a crane operator to let one of the crates drop upon arrival. On that day, the dockside was suddenly covered with new Soviet Kalashnikov rifles. Through an equally clever ploy at the Khartoum, Sudan airport, the CIA managed to separate a Congolese courier from a suitcase of Soviet money destined for Gizenga. The State Department, meanwhile, was, in its own words, urging Adula to dismiss Gizenga and declare him in rebellion against the national government, so that police action can now be taken against him. We're also urging the UN to take military action to break his rebellion. We are making every effort to keep Gizenga isolated from potential domestic and foreign support. We have taken care to ensure that this U.S. aid has been channeled through the central government in order to provide economic incentive to encourage support for that government. The CIA was supplying arms and money to Adula's supporters, as well as to Mobutu's. Adula, who had a background of close ties to both the American labor movement. The American labor movement? Oh, right. The American labor movement, of which was mostly white people-ish, who had a background of close ties to both the American labor movement and the CIA International Labor Movement via the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, see British Guiana chapter. I think, yeah, we covered that one, or read that one already. Was chosen to be prime minister instead of Gizenga by a parliamentary conference during which the parliamentarians were bribed by the CIA and even by the United Nations. A subsequent CIA memorandum was apparently paying tribute to this when it stated, "The UN and the United States, in closely coordinated activities, played essential roles in this significant success over Gizenga. Good old democracy. TM. Big Money Johnson." In January 1962, United Nations forces with strong American backing ousted Gizenga and his followers from Stanleyville, and a year later finally forced Tshombe to end his secession into Katanga. These actions were carried out in the name of uniting the Congo, as if this were a matter to be decided by other than Congolese. Never before had the UN engaged in such offensive military operations, and the World Organization was criticized in various quarters for having exceeded its charter. In any event, the operations served only to temporarily slow down the dreary procession of changing leaders, attempted coups, autonomous armies, shifting alliances, and rebellions. Adding an ironic and absurd touch to the American Congo policy, 3 months after the successful action against Gizenga, Alan Dulles, thanks to the Bay of Pigs, now the former director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, informed the television audience that the United States had overrated the danger of Soviet involvement. It looked as though they were going to make a serious attempt at takeover in the Belgian Congo. Well, it did not work out that way at all. Nonetheless, by the middle of 1964, when rebellion by the heirs of Lumumba and Gizenga was more widespread and furious than ever, and the collapse of the central government appeared as a real possibility, the United States was pouring in a prodigious amount of military aid to the Leopoldville regime. In addition to providing arms and planes, Washington dispatched some 100 to 200 military and technical personnel to the Congo to aid government troops, and the CIA was conducting a paramilitary campaign against the insurgents in the eastern part of the country. The government was now headed by none other than Moise Tshombe, a man called Africa's most unpopular African. for his widely recognized role in the murder of the popular Lumumba and for his use of white mercenaries, many of them South Africans and Rhodesians. Oh my. During his secession attempt in Katanga, Tshombe defended the latter action by explaining that his troops would not fight without white officers. Tshombe once again called upon his white mercenary army, numbering 400 to 500 men, and the CIA called upon its own mercenaries as well, a band which included Americans, Cuban exile veterans of the Bay of Pigs, Rhodesians, and South Africans. Damn, they both got Rhodesians and South Africans. The latter having been recruited with the help of the South African government. Bringing in our own animals was the way one CIA operative described the operation. The agency's pilots carried out regular bombing and strafing missions against the insurgents, although some of the Cubans were reported to be troubled at being ordered to make indiscriminate attacks upon civilians. Looking back at the affair in 1966, the New York Times credited the CIA with having created an instant air force in the Congo. When China protested to the United States about the use of American pilots in the Congo, the State Department issued an explicit denial, then publicly reversed itself, but insisted that the Americans were flying under contract with the Congolese government. Oh, it's fine because they're under contract. It's okay because Congolese are paying them. Okay. The next day, the department said that the flights would stop after having obtained assurances from other arms of the U.S. government. Although it still held to the position that the matter was one between the Congolese government and civilian individuals, aka CIA, who were not violating American law, TMTM. The Congolese against whom this array of military might was brought to bear were a coalition of forces. Some of the leading figures had spent time in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, or China, and were receiving token amounts of arms and instruction from those countries, but they were never necessarily in the communist camp any more than the countless third worlders who have gone to university in the United States and have been courted afterwards are necessarily in the Western capitalist camp. This does not hold for professional military officers who, unlike students, tends to be a particularly homogeneous group, conservative, authoritarian, and anti-communist. Africa scholar M. Crawford Young has observed that amongst the coalition leadership, the destruction of the Leopold regime, a vigorous reassertion of Congolese control over its own destiny, and a vague socialist commitment were recurrent themes. But at bottom, it appeared far more a frame of mind and a style of expression than an interrelated set of ideas. The rebels had no revolutionary program they could or did proclaim. Coexisting with this element within the coalition were currents of various esoteric churches, messianic sects, witch-finding movements, and other occult inspirations, as well as plain opportunists. Many believed that the magic of their witch doctors would protect them against bullets. One of their leaders, Pierre Mulele, was a quasi-Catholic who baptized his followers in his own urine to also make them immune to bullets. That probably didn't work out, eh? The insurgents were further divided. The insurgents were further divided along tribal lines and were rent by debilitating factionalism. No single group or belief could dominate. Wait, he used the word factionalism this time, but earlier he used the word tribalism instead. Even though they're basically the same thing, you could just use them, whatever. Doesn't matter, I guess. Rebel success created the image of unified purpose and revolutionary promise, wrote Young. Only in its subsequent phase of decay and disintegration did the coalition's dramatic lack of cohesion and disparity in purpose and perception become fully evident. No revolutionary theory. Get crunched. Become fully evident. The New York Times addressed the question of the coalition's ideology as follows. There is evidence that most supporters of the Stanleyville regime have no ideological commitment, but are mainly Congolese who are disillusioned with corruption and irresponsibility. that has characterized the Leopoldville regimes. The rebel leaders have received advice and money from communists, but few, if any, of the rebels consider themselves communists. It is probable that few have heard of communist Santa Claus. Karl Marx. In the coalition-controlled area of Stanleyville, between 2,000 and 3,000 white foreigners found themselves trapped by the war. One of the rebel leaders, Christopher Gabinier, conditioned their safe release upon various military concessions, principally a cessation of American bombing, but negotiations failed to produce an agreement. Instead, on 24th November 1964, the United States and Belgium staged a dramatic rescue mission in which over 500 Belgian paratroopers were dropped at dawn into Stanleyville from American transport planes. Much chaos followed, and the reports are conflicting, but it appears that more than 2,000 hostages were rescued, in the process of which the fleeing rebels massacred about 100 others and dragged several hundred more into the bush. American and Belgian officials took great pains to emphasize the purely humanitarian purpose of the mission. However, the rescuers simultaneously executed a key military maneuver when they seized the strategic points of the city and coordinated their operation with the advancing columns of Tshombe's mercenary army that was moving swiftly toward the city. Yeah, that's a very humanitarian mission. Moreover, in the process of the rescue, the rescuers killed dozens of rebels and did nothing to curtail Tshombe's troops when they reached Stanleyville and began an orgy of looting and killing. Tshombe may have provided a reminder. Oh, right, yeah, because Tshombe was the Katanga, the region where all the rare metals were at, or whatever. I don't remember. Tshombe may have provided a reminder of the larger-than-humanitarian stake at hand in the Congo, when, in the flush of the day's success, he talked openly with a correspondent of the Times of London, who reported that Tshombe was confident that the fall of Stanleyville would give a new impetus to the economy and encourage investors. It would reinforce a big development plan announced this morning in collaboration with the United States, Britain, and West Germany. The collapse of the rebels' stronghold in Stanleyville marked the beginning of the end for their cause. By spring 1965, their fortune was in sharp decline, and the arrival of about 100 Cuban revolutionaries, amongst whom was Che Guevara himself, had no known effect upon the course of events. Several months later, Guevara returned to Cuba in disgust at the low level of revolutionary zeal exhibited by the Congolese guerrillas and the local populace. I don't know if they're going to mention it, but let me look it up again. Was it really called Guevarism? No, there was whatever that thing. Don't spend long enough developing, quote unquote, developing the revolutionary consciousness. TM. No, it's like can't just roll in there and tell a guy to read a book or whatever. Okay. The concluding tone from the musical chairs was played in November when Joseph Mobutu overthrew Tshombe and Kasavubu. Mobutu, later to adopt the name Mobutu Sese Seko, has ruled with a heavy dictatorial hand ever since. And by that, they mean until the late 90s or so, at least. Because this book is like 20, 30 years old now, I think. In the final analysis, it mattered precious little to the interests of the U.S. government whether the forces it had helped to defeat were really communist or not, by whatever definition. The working premise was that there was now fixed in power over a more or less unified Congo, a man who would be more cooperative with the CIA in its African adventures and with Western capital, and less accessible to the socialist bloc than the likes of Lumumba, Gizenga et al. Would have been. The CIA has chalked this one up as a victory. What the people of the Congo, now Zaire, okay, well, I guess it's called the Congo again, one is not clear. Under Mobutu, terror and repression became facts of daily life. Civil liberties and other human rights were markedly absent. The country remains one of the poorest to be found anywhere, despite its vast natural riches. Mobutu, however, is reputed to be one of the richest heads of state in the world. Let's see if I'll take a look at stuff. He died in 97. Okay, reverted to the Democratic Republic of the... Or hold on, let me ignore the AI overview. Can't trust him. Yeah, he was overthrown on... Whatever. Shmee. See. William Atwood, U.S. Ambassador to Kenya in 1964 to 65, who played a part in the hostage negotiations, also saw the U.S. role in the Congo in a positive light. Bemoaning African suspicions toward American motives there, he wrote, it was hard to convince people that we had provided the Congo with $420 million in aid since independence just to prevent chaos. They couldn't believe any country could be that altruistic. For $420 million in aid? Yeah, quote-unquote aid to train CIA-backed rebels to overthrow the whatever, da-da-da. No, Atwood's comment is easier to understand when one realizes that the word chaos has long been used by American officials to refer to a situation over which the United States has insufficient control to assure that someone distinctly pro-Western will remain in or come to power. When President Eisenhower, for example, decided to send troops into Lebanon in 1958, he saw it as a move, he later wrote, to stop the trend toward chaos. Brazil mentioned the return of Brazil. I don't know if there was a chapter on Brazil yet. Brazil, 1961, 1964. Actually, I'm going to go and... Nah, Muddy's got to do their drawing thing. I'm hungry. Muddy promised me Costco pizza. A foolish thing to say, to be sure, because my will is going to waver now. I'm going to shrivel up. No, it's fine. Let's read about Brazil. Brazil mentioned. What? Brazil, 1961 to 1964. Oh my god, death squads. I never actually... Coca-Cola death squads? No, I never actually read in depth about them. Now I get to... Maybe I shouldn't sound so excited about that. Introducing the marvelous new world of death squads. When the leading members of the U.S. diplomatic mission in Brazil... Oh, hello. Oh, hi, thank you for the follow. Nona Suami. Oh, I actually saw you join in the Discord earlier as well. I hope you do. I totally finished one of those chibis a few days ago, and the other one's sketched, and I'm just kind of... Well, the first thing was, oh, that I thought was, oh, they must want their chibis. But no, Kef. Okay. When the leading members of the U.S. diplomatic mission in Brazil held a meeting one day in March 1964, they arrived at the consensus that President João Goulart's support of social and economic reforms was a contrived and thinly veiled vehicle to seize dictatorial power. Maya, dropping a follow before I fall asleep here. Oh, okay. Thanks. I saw the VOD skimming or account earlier. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm like the worst commission artist ever, I think. Well, not the worst ever. I haven't had no one's made a call out post about me yet. So I guess I'll stay winning or whatever. Okay, let's see. When the leading members of the U.S. diplomatic mission in Brazil held a meeting one day in March 1964, they arrived at the consensus that President João Goulart's support of social and economic reforms was a contrived and thinly veiled vehicle to seize dictatorial power. The American ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, informed the State Department that a desperate lunge by Goulart for totalitarian power might be made at any time. The Brazilian Army Chief of Staff, General Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco, provided the American embassy with a memorandum in which he stated his fear that Goulart was seeking to close down Congress and initiate a dictatorship. Within a week after the expression of these concerns, the Brazilian military, with Castelo Branco at its head, overthrew the constitutional government of President Goulart, the culmination of a conspiratorial process in which the American embassy had been intimately involved. The military then proceeded to install and maintain for 2 decades one of the most brutal dictatorships in all of South America. What are we to make of all of this? The idea that men of rank and power lie to the public is commonplace, not worthy of debate. But do they as readily lie to each other? Is their need to rationalize their misdeeds so great that they provide each other a moral shoulder to lean on? Men use thoughts only to justify their injustices, wrote to Voltaire, and speech only to conceal their thoughts. Wow, this guy doesn't have a very high opinion of the little guys. I guess that's capital M, men. And you can just sidestep into being an NB and then everything's good. The actual American motivation in supporting the coup was something rather less heroic than preserving democracy, even mundane as such matters go. American opposition to Goulart, who became president in 1961, rested upon a familiar catalog of complaints. U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, oh my god, the Call of Duty Zombies guy is back. U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara questioned Brazil's neutral stand in foreign policy. The Brazilian ambassador in Washington, Roberto Campos, responded that neutralism was an inadequate term and explained that what was involved was really a deep urge of the Brazilian people to assert their personality in world affairs. Oh my god, independence? Autonomy? That's fucked up. You can't do that. American officials did not approve of some of the members of Goulart's cabinet and said so. Ambassador Campos pointed out to them that it was quite inappropriate for the United States to try to influence the composition of the cabinet. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met with Goulart and expressed his uneasiness about the Brazilian president allowing communists to hold positions in government agencies. Bobby was presumably acting on the old and very deep-seated American belief that once you welcomed 1 or 2 communists into your parlor, those damn transgender homosexual communists, they take over the whole house and sign the deed over to Moscow. Goulart did not see this as a danger. He replied that he was in full control of the situation, later remarking to Campos that it was as if he had been told that he had no capacity for judging the men around him. The American Defense Attaché in Brazil, Colonel Vernon Walters, reported that Goulart showed favoritism toward ultra-nationalist military officers over pro-U.S. officers. Goulart saw it as promoting those officers who appeared to be most loyal to his government. He was, as it happens, very concerned about American-encouraged military coups, and said so explicitly to President Kennedy. Goulart considered purchasing helicopters from Poland because Washington was delaying on his request to purchase them from the United States. Ambassador Gordon told them that he could not expect the United States to like it. Oh, you bought arms from one of our enemies because we refused to sell stuff to you? Oh, I'm so incensed. I can't believe you're darn commies. The communists have infiltrated yet again. No, the Goulart administration, moreover, passed a law limiting the amount of profits multinationals could transmit out of the country, and a subsidiary of ITT was nationalized. ITT. Compensation for the takeover was slow in coming because of Brazil's precarious financial position, but these were the only significant actions taken against U.S. corporate interests. Let's see, Brazil, ITT. Oh, AI overview moment. Okay. 1962. We'll take that year. And we'll look at this website. International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT. Yeah, okay. Well, I guess, I don't know. Yeah. Inextricably woven into all these complaints, yet at the same time standing apart, was Washington's dismay with Brazil's drift to the left, the communist, leftist influence in the labor movement, leftist infiltration where everyone looked, anti-Americanism among students and others. The American Consul General in Sao Paulo suggested to the State Department that the United States found competing student organizations. The general erosion of U.S. influence and the power of people and groups friendly to the United States. One might go so far as to suggest that Washington officials felt unloved, were out for the fact that the coup, as they well knew from much past experience, could result only in intensified anti-Americanism all over Latin America. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Goulart's predecessor, Janio da Silva Quadros, had also irritated Washington. Why should the United States trade with Russia and her satellites, but insist that Brazil trade only with the United States, he asked, and proceeded to negotiate with the Soviet Union and other communist countries to re-establish diplomatic and commercial relations. He was, in a word, independent. Oh, they don't like it when the sassy, independent country buys, trades with whoever they want. So messed up. Quadros was also more or less a conservative. Who clamped down hard on unions, sent federal troops to the Northeast hunger dens to squash protest, and jailed disobedient students. But he wasn't U.S. aligned enough, even then, I guess. But the American ambassador at the time, John Moores, or whatever. Okay, that's just the previous one. But the American ambassador at the time, John Moores Cabot, saw fit to question Brazil's taking part in a meeting of uncommitted, non-aligned nations. Brazil has signed various obligations with the United States and American nations, he said. I am sure Brazil is not going to forget her obligations. It is committed. It is a fact. Brazil can uncommit itself if it wants. In early 1961, shortly after Quadros took office, he was visited by... Damn, imagine having that name. In 1961, shortly after Quadros took office, he was visited by Adolf Berle Jr., President Kennedy's advisor on Latin American affairs. Oh, that must be one of those guys they scooped up from Germany. No, and formerly ambassador to Brazil. Berle. No, I'm going to say Berle. Even though there's more than one way to spell it, and I don't think that's really how. Berle had come as Kennedy's special envoy to solicit Quadros' backing for the impending Bay of Pigs invasion. Ambassador Cabot was president, and some years later described the meeting to author Peter Bell. Bell has written, Ambassador Cabot remembers a stormy conversation in which Bell stated the United States had $300 million in reserve for Brazil, and in effect offered it as a bribe for Brazilian cooperation. Quadros became visibly irritated after Bell refused to heed his third no. No Brazilian official was at the airport the next day to see the envoy off. Quadros, who had been elected by a record margin, was, like Goulart, accused of seeking to set up a dictatorship because he sought to put teeth into measures unpopular with the oligarchy, the military, and/or the United States, as well as pursuing a pro-communist foreign policy. After but 7 months in office, he suddenly resigned, reportedly under military pressure, if not outright threat, in his letter of resignation. He blamed his predicament on reactionaries and the ambitions of groups of individuals, some of whom are foreigners, the terrible forces that arose against me. A few months later, Quadros reappeared to deliver a speech in which he named Barrow, Cabot, and U.S. Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon as being among those who had contributed to his downfall. Dillon, he said, sought to mix foreign policy with Brazil's need for foreign credits. Both Barrow and Cabot had been advocates of the 1954 overthrow of Guatemalan President Arbenz, whose sins, in Washington's eyes, were much the same as those Goulart was now guilty of. Goulart. At the same time, Quadros announced his intention to lead a people's crusade against the reactionaries, the corrupt, and the communists. As Quadros' vice president, Goulart succeeded to the presidency in August 1961, despite a virtual coup and civil war initiated by segments of the military to block him, because he was seen as some sort of dangerous radical. Only the intervention of loyalist military units and other supporters of the constitutional process allowed Goulart to take office. The military opposition to Goulart arose, it should be noted, before he had the opportunity to exhibit his alleged tendencies toward dictatorship. Indeed, as early as 1954, the military had demonstrated its antipathy toward him by forcing President Vargas to fire him from his position as Minister of Labor. The American doubts about Goulart also predated his presidency. In 1960, when Goulart was elected vice president, concern at the State Department and the Pentagon turned to panic, according to an American official who served in Brazil. Goulart tried to continue Quadros' independent foreign policy. His government went ahead with resumption of relations with socialist countries, and at a meeting of the Organization of American States in December 1961, Brazil abstained on a vote to hold a special session aimed at discussing the Cuban problem, and stood strongly opposed to sanctions against the Castro government. A few months later, speaking before the U.S. Congress, Goulart affirmed Brazil's right to take its own stand on some of the Cold War issues. He declared that Brazil identified itself with the democratic principles which unite the peoples of the West, but was not part of any politico-military bloc. The democratic principles of pumping money into the side that you want to win so that you can have another puppet government in the third world. I mean, meouch. Time magazine, in common with most U.S. media, has a difficult time understanding the concept and practice of independence amongst America's allies. In November 1961, the magazine wrote, Brazil is just a confused country. It doesn't know. Blah, blah, blah. In November 1961, the magazine wrote that Brazil's domestic politics were confused and that the country was also adrift in foreign affairs. Goulart was trying to play the old Quadros game of international independence, which means we in the East while panhandling from the West. West and East? Yeah, that sounds like a totally normal balance. Time was critical of Goulart in that he had sought an invitation to visit Washington, and on the same day he received it. He called in Communist Poland's visiting foreign minister, Adam Rapaki, and awarded him the Order of the Southern Cross, the same decoration that Quadros hung on Cuba's Marxist mastermind Che Guevara. Rubbing hands together, such a mastermind. Okay. Former Time editor and Latin American correspondent John Garassi commented that every visiting foreign dignitary received this medal, the Cruzeiro do Sul, as part of protocol. He added, apparently Time thinks that any president who wants to visit us must necessarily hate our enemies as a consequence, and is confused whenever this does not occur. But, of course, Time magazine is so unused to the word independent that an independent foreign policy must be very confusing indeed. In South America, where everyone would like to follow an independent foreign policy, but where only Brazil has, at times, the courage, no one was confused. Goulart, a millionaire landowner and a Catholic who wore a medal of the Virgin around his neck, was no more a communist than was Quadros, and he strongly supported the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. He offered Ambassador Gordon a toast to the Yankee victory, perhaps unaware that only 3 weeks earlier, during federal and state elections in Brazil, CIA money had been liberally expended in support of anti-Goulart candidates. Former CIA officer Philip A.G. has stated that the agency spent between $12 and $20 million on behalf of hundreds of candidates. Lincoln Gordon says the funding came to no more than $5 million. He would downplay himself. They would downplay themselves one thing. In addition to the direct campaign contributions, the CIA dipped into its bag of dirty tricks to torment the campaigns of leftist candidates. At the same time, the Agency for International Development, or USAID, at the express request of President Kennedy, was allocating monies to projects aimed at benefiting chosen gubernatorial candidates. While Goulart was president, no new U.S. economic assistance was given to the central government, while regional assistance was provided on a markedly ideological basis. When the military took power, this pattern was sharply altered. AG adds that the CIA carried out a consistent propaganda campaign against Goulart, which dated from at least the 1962 election operation, and which included the financing of mass urban demonstrations, proving the old themes of God, country, family, and liberty to be as effective as ever in undermining a government. CIA money also found its way to a chain of right-wing newspapers, Diarias Asociadas, to promote anti-communism, for the distribution of 50,000 books of similar politics to high school and college students, and for the formation of women's groups with their special Latin mothers' emphasis on the godlessness of the communist enemy. I'm gonna have to get Commie Jesus out here in addition to Communist Santa Claus. Okay. The women and other CIA operatives also went into the rumor-mongering business, spreading stories about outrages Goulart and his cronies were supposed to be planning, such as altering the Constitution so as to extend his term, and gossip about Goulart being a cuckold and a wife-beater. And they kink-shaming him. Sorry. Too sad. All is to overthrow a man who, in April 1962, had received a ticker tape parade in New York City, was warmly welcomed to the White House by President Kennedy, and had addressed a joint session of Congress. The intra-service confrontation which had attended Goulart's accession to power apparently kept a rein. Itchy nose. The intra-service confrontation which had attended Goulart's accession to power apparently kept a rein on coup-minded officers until 1963. In March of that year, the CIA informed Washington, but not Goulart, of a plot by conservative officers. During the course of the following year, the plots thickened. Brazilian military officers could not abide by Goulart's attempts at populist social reforms, though his program was timid, his rhetoric generally mild, and his actions seldom matched either. He himself pointed out that General Douglas MacArthur had carried out a more radical distribution of land in Japan after the Second World War than anything planned by the Brazilian government. The military men were particularly incensed at Goulart's support of a weakening of military discipline and his attempts to build up a following among non-commissioned officers. This the president was genuinely serious about because of his paranoia about a coup. NCO, non-commissioned officers, that just means ones that started out as grunts, didn't go to Army College. Army University. They didn't get trained in overthrowing governments or whatever. No, okay. Goulart's wooing of NCOs and his appeals to the population over the heads of a hostile Congress and state governors, something President Reagan later did on several occasions, were the kinds of tactics his enemies labeled as dictatorial. In early 1964, disclosed Fortune magazine after the coup, an emissary was sent by some of the military plotters to ask U.S. Ambassador Lincoln Gordon what the U.S. position would be if civil war broke out. The emissary reported back that Gordon was cautious and diplomatic, but he left the impression that if the plotters could hold out for 48 hours, they would get U.S. recognition and help. The primary American contact with the conspirators was Defense Attaché Vernon Walters, who arrived in Brazil after having been apprised that President Kennedy would not be averse to the overthrow of João Goulart. Walters, who later became deputy director of the CIA, had an intimacy with leading Brazilian military officers, particularly General Castelo Branco, going back to World War II, when Walters had served as interpreter for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, then fighting in Italy with the Allies. Brazil was the only Latin American country to send ground combat troops to the war, and it allowed the United States to build huge aircraft staging bases on its territory. Womp womp. The relationship between U.S. and Brazilian officers was continued and enhanced after the war by the creation of the Higher War College, Escola Superior de Guerra, in Rio de Janeiro in 1949. Latin America historian Thomas E. Skidmore, because his underwear's got more Skidmore. No, okay, has observed. Under the U.S.-Brazilian military agreements of the early 1950s, the U.S. Army received exclusive rights to render assistance in the organization and operation of the college, which had been modeled on the National War College in Washington. In view of the fact that the Brazilian War College became a rallying point for leading military opponents of civilian populist politicians, it would be worth examining the extent to which the strongly anti-communist ideology, bordering on an anti-political attitude of certain officers, was reinforced or moderated by their frequent contacts with United States officers. There was, moreover, the ongoing U.S. military assistance program, which Ambassador Gordon described as a major vehicle for establishing close relationships with personnel of the armed forces and a highly important factor in influencing the Brazilian military to be pro-U.S. A week before the coup, Castelo Branco, who emerged as the leader of the conspirators, gave Walters a copy of a paper he had written, which was in effect a justification for a military coup. Another variation on the theme of upholding the Constitution by preventing Goulart from instituting a dictatorship. Yeah, and then eventually we can have our own dictatorship and it'll be all gravy, you know. To Lincoln Gordon and other American officials, civil war appeared a real possibility as a result of a coup attempt. As the scheduled day approached, contingency plans were set up. A large quantity of petroleum would be sent to Brazil and made available to the insurgent officers, an especially vital commodity if Goulart supporters in the State Oil Union were to blow up or control the refineries. A U.S. Navy task force would be dispatched to Brazilian coastal waters, the presence of which would deliver an obvious message to opponents of the coup. Arms and ammunition would be sent to Branco's forces to meet their fighting needs. Concerned that the coup attempt might be met by a general strike, Washington discussed with Gordon the possible need for the U.S. to mount a large material program to assure the success of the takeover. The conspirators had already requested economic aid from the United States in the event of their success to get the government and economy moving again, and had received a generally favorable response. At the same time, Gordon sent word to some anti-Goulart state governors emphasizing the necessity, from the American point of view, that the new regime has a claim to legitimacy. The ambassador also met with former President Juscelino Kubitschek to urge him to take a stronger position against Goulart. And to use his considerable influence to swing a large congressional group and thereby influence the legitimacy issue. Of the American contingency measures, indications are that it was the naval show of force, which it turned out included an aircraft carrier, destroyers, and guided missiles, which most encouraged the Brazilian military plotters or convinced those still wavering in their commitment. Another actor in the unfolding drama was the American Institute for Free Labor Development. The AIFLD came formally into being in 1961 and was technically under the direction of the American labor movement. AFL-CIO. Oh yeah, we read in the Settlers book that the AFL-CIO was kind of cringe, not gonna lie. The AIFLD came formally into being in 1961 and was technically under the direction of the American labor movement, AFL-CIO, but was soon being funded almost exclusively by the U.S. government, aid, and serving consistently as a CIA instrument in most countries of Latin America. Free labor development, as in making sure that we free up your labor over there to exploit? No. Okay. In May 1963, the AIFLD founded the Instituto Cultural Trabalho in Brazil, which over the next 2 years gave courses to more than 7,000 union leaders and members. Other Brazilians went to the United States for training. When they returned to Brazil, said AIFLD executive Willem Doherty Jr., I'm just going to call it Eiffeld now. Executive William Doherty Jr., some of them became intimately involved in some of the clandestine operations of the revolution before it took place on April 1st. What happened in Brazil on April 1st did not just happen. It was planned, and planned months in advance. Many of the trade union leaders, some of whom were actually trained in our institute, were involved in the revolution and in the overthrow of the Goulart regime. Doherty did not spell out any details of the Eiffeld role in the coup, or revolution as he called it, color revolution, although Reader's Digest later reported that one of the Eiffeld-trained labor leaders set up courses for communication workers in combating communism in the labor movement in Brazil, and after every class, he quietly warned key workers of coming trouble and urged them to keep communications going no matter what happened. Additionally, Richard de Martinez, an unwitting CIA contract employee who was sent to Brazil to work with the agency's Post, Telegraph, and Telephone Workers International, formerly Doherty's domain, has revealed that his field workers in Brazil burned down Communist Party headquarters at the time of the coup. The coup began on 31st March 1964 with the advance upon Rio of troops and tanks. Officers obtained the support of some units of enlisted men by telling them they were heading for the city to secure it against Goulart's enemies. But at the main Air Force Base, pro-Goulart enlisted men, hearing of the move toward Rio... Wait, hold on. Okay. Let's see. Pro-Goulart enlisted men, hearing of the move toward Rio, seized the base and put their officers under arrest. Indecision and cold feet intervened, however, and what might have reversed the course of events instead came to naught. Other military units loyal to Goulart took actions elsewhere, but these too fizzled out. Here and there, a scattering of workers went out on strike. Several short-lived, impotent demonstrations took place, but there was little else. A number of labor leaders and radicals were rounded up on the orders of certain state governors. Those who were opposed to what was happening were not prepared for violent resistance. In one incident, a group of students staged a protest. Some charged up the stairs of an armed organization, but the guard fired into their midst, killing 2 of them and forcing the others to fall back. There's a book. There's too many books for me to read, but I don't remember where I saw this, actually. Oh, it was in the comments of something or other. There was 2 books that I've added to my infinite list of books to read. One's called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed by Charles Cobb, and the other one's How Nonviolence Protects the State by Peter Gelderloos. And I think caveat that I saw included somewhere. I think the thrust of it is that if it's purely nonviolent stuff, then yeah, it doesn't really do anything. There has to be an accompanying threat of violence or whatever, etc. Actual material stuff. Let's see. Most people counted on loyal armed forces to do their duty, or waited for the word from Goulart. Goulart, however, was unwilling to give the call for a civil war. He did not want to be responsible, he said, for bloodshed amongst Brazilians, and fled to Uruguay. Damn. Oof. Lincoln Gordon. Oh, okay. Lincoln Gordon cabled Washington the good news, suggesting the avoidance of a jubilant posture. He described the coup as a great victory for the free world, adding in a remark that might have had difficulty getting past the lips of even John Foster Dulles that without the coup there could have been a total loss to the west of all South American republics. Following a victory parade in Rio on 2nd of April by those pleased with the coup, a march of family with God for Liberty, Gordon informed the State Department that the only unfortunate note was the obviously limited participation in the march of the lower classes. His cable work done, the former Harvard professor turns his attention back to trying to persuade the Brazilian Congress to bestow a seal of legitimacy upon the new government. 2 years later, Gordon was to be questioned by a senator during hearings to consider his nomination as Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. I am particularly concerned, said the senator, with the part you may have played, if any, in encouraging, promoting, or causing that overthrow. Said Lincoln Gordon, the answer to that, Senator, is very simple. The movement which overthrew President Goulart was a purely 100%, not 99.44, but 100% purely Brazilian movement. Neither the American Embassy nor I personally played any part in the process whatsoever. Excuse me. Gordon's boss, Gene Rusk, was not any more forthright. When asked about Cuban charges that the United States was behind the coup, the Secretary of State responded, well, there's just not one iota of truth in this. It's just not so in any way, shape, or form. While Attorney General Robert Kennedy's view of the affair stated to Gordon was, well, Goulart got what was coming to him. Too bad he didn't follow the advice we gave him when I was there. Gordon artfully combined fast talk with omission of certain key facts about Brazilian politics. His summary of Goulart's rise and fall made no mention at all of the military's move to keep him from taking office in 1961, to convince the assembled senators that Goulart was indeed seeking to set up a personal dictatorship. Depending on the setting, either saving Brazil from dictatorship or saving Brazil from communism, was advanced as rationale for what took place in 1964. General Andrew O'Meara, head of the U.S. Southern Latin America Command. Oh, that's right. They have a U.S. command for like every part of the world. They even got a U.S. command for space, just for fun, if I remember right. Because they're a fucked up little guy. Had it both ways. He told a House committee that the coming to power of the Castelo Branco government in Brazil last April saved that country from an immediate dictatorship which could have only been followed by communist domination. The rescue from communism position was especially difficult to support. The problem being that the communists in Brazil did not, after all, do anything which the United States could point to. Moreover, the Soviet Union was scarcely in the picture. Early in 1964, reported a Brazilian newspaper, Russian leader Khrushchev told the Brazilian Communist Party that the Soviet Union did not wish either to give financial aid to the Goulart regime or to tangle with the United States over the country. In his reminiscences, albeit, as mentioned earlier, not meant to be a serious work of history. Oh, right, because it was edited by, another guy. When translated, Khrushchev does not give an index reference to Brazil. A year after the coup, trade between Brazil and the USSR was running at $120 million per year, and a Brazilian mission was planning to go to Moscow to explore Soviet willingness to provide a major industrial plant. The following year, the Russians invited the new Brazilian president-to-be, General Costa e Silva, to visit the Soviet Union. During the entire life of the military dictatorship, extending into the 1980s, Brazil and the Soviet bloc engaged in extensive trade and economic cooperation, reaching billions of dollars per year, and including the building of several large hydroelectric plants in Brazil. A similar economic relationship existed between the Soviet bloc and the Argentine military dictatorship of 1976 to 83, so much so that in 1982, when Soviet leader Brezhnev died, the Argentine government declared a national day of mourning. It was only by ignoring facts like these during the Cold War that the anti-communist propaganda machine of the United States could preach about the international communist conspiracy and claim that the coup in Brazil had saved the country from communism. For a typical example of this propaganda, one must read The Country That Saved Itself, which appeared in Reader's Digest several months after the coup. The innumerable lies about what occurred in Brazil, fed by the magazine to its millions of readers, undoubtedly played a role in preparing the American public for the great anti-communist crusade in Vietnam, just picking up steam at the time. The article began, "Seldom has a major nation come closer to the brink of disaster and yet recovered than did Brazil in its recent triumph over red subversion. The communist drive for domination, marked by propaganda, infiltration, terror, was moving in high gear. Total surrender seemed imminent. And then the people said no." Although, they didn't show up to the celebratory march afterward, but they said no. The type of independence shown by the Brazilian military government in its economic relations with the Soviet Union was something Washington could accept from a conservative government. Even the occasional nationalization of American property, when it knew that the government could be relied upon to keep the left suppressed at home and to help in the vital Cold War anti-communist campaigns abroad. In 1965, Brazil sent 1,100 troops to the Dominican Republic in support of the U.S. invasion, the only country in Latin America to send more than a token force. And in 1971 and 73, the Brazilian military and intelligence apparatuses contributed to the American efforts in overthrowing the governments of Bolivia and Chile. The United States did not rest on its laurels. CIA headquarters immediately began to generate hemisphere-wide propaganda as only the agency's far-flung press asset network could, in support of the new Brazilian government and to discredit Goulart. Dean Rusk, concerned that Goulart might be received in Uruguay as if he were still Brazil's president on the grounds that he had not resigned, cabled the American embassy in Montevideo that it would be useful if you could quietly bring to the attention of appropriate officials that despite his allegations to the contrary, Goulart has abandoned his office. At the same time, the CIA station in Uruguay undertook a program of surveillance of Brazilian exiles who had fled from the military takeover to prevent them from instigating any kind of insurgency movement in their homeland. It was a simple matter for the agency to ask their paid friend, the head of Uruguayan intelligence, to place his officers at the residences of Goulart and other key Brazilians. The officers kept logs of visitors while posing as personal security men for the exiles. Although it is unlikely that the exiles swallowed this story. In the first few days following the coup, several thousand Brazilians were arrested, communists and suspected communists all. AIFLD graduates were promptly appointed by the new government to purge the unions. Good old labor union moment. Yeehaw. So American pill. Okay, though Ambassador Gordon had assured the State Department before the coup that the armed forces would be quick to restore constitutional institutions and return power to civilian hands, this was not to be. Within days, General Castelo Branco assumed to the presidency, and over the next few years, his regime instituted all the features of military dictatorship, which Latin America has come to know and love. Congress was shut down, political opposition was reduced to virtual extinction, habeas corpus for political crimes. Habeas corpus. Mamma mia. I don't know what that means. Because I keep forgetting, because they got these big words and shit. It is a legal procedure invoking the jurisdiction of a court to review the unlawful detention or imprisonment of an individual and request the individual's custodian to bring the president to court to determine whether their detention is lawful. So basically to review your imprisonment to see if you can, like, not be imprisoned. Let's see. Habeas corpus for political crimes was suspended. Criticism of the president was forbidden by law. Labor unions were taken over by government interveners. Mounting protests were met by police and military firing into crowds. The use of systematic disappearance as a form of repression came upon the stage of Latin America. Peasants' homes were burned down. Priests were brutalized. The government had a name for its program. The moral rehabilitation of Brazil. Then there was the torture and the death squads, both largely undertakings of the police and the military, both underwritten by the United States. In the chapters on Guatemala and Uruguay, we shall see how the U.S. More chapters? We shall see how the U.S. Office of Public Safety, OPS, the CIA, and AID combined to provide the technical training, the equipment, and the indoctrination which supported the horrors in those countries. It was no less the case in Brazil. Dan Mitrione of the OPS, whom we shall encounter in his full beauty in Uruguay, began his career in Brazil in the 1960s. By 1969, OPS had established a national police force for Brazil and had trained over 100,000 policemen in the country, in addition to 523 receiving more advanced instruction in the United States. About one-third of the students' time at the police academies was devoted to lectures on the communist menace and the need to battle against it. You gotta make sure we could protect American democracy and by firing into crowds and death squads. The bomb school and techniques of riot control were other important aspects of their education. Tortures range from simple but brutal blows from a truncheon, oh, that's like a club, to electric shocks. Often the torture is more refined. Oh, we're about to read something gnarly. Often the torture is more refined. the end of a reed is placed in the anus of a naked man hanging suspended downwards on the pau de arara, parrot's perch, and a piece of cotton soaked in petrol is lit at the other end of the reed. Pregnant women have been forced to watch their husbands being tortured. Other wives have been hung naked beside their husbands and given electric shocks on sexual parts of their body while subjected to worst kind of obscenities. Children have been tortured before their parents and vice versa. At least one child, the 3-month-old baby of Virgilio Gomez da Silva, was reported to have died under police torture. Bro, they were smacking the baby? The length of sessions depends upon the resistance capacity of the victims and have sometimes continued for days at a time. Amnesty International. Judge Agamemnon Duarte indicated that the CCC, Commandos to Hunt Communists, a death squad armed and aided by the police, and the CIA are implicated in the murder of Father Henrique Neto. He admitted that the American Secret Service, CIA, was behind the CCC. Jornal do Brasil. Chief of Staff of the American Army, General Breno Borges Forte, at the 10th Conference of American Armies in 1973. The enemy is undefined. It adapts to any environment and uses every means, both licit and illicit, to achieve its aims. It disguises itself as a priest, a student, or a campesino, peasant farmer. As a defender of democracy or an advanced intellectual, as a pious soul, or as an extremist protester, it goes into the fields and the schools, the factories and the churches, the universities and the magistracy, if necessary, to wear a uniform or civil garb. In sum, it will take on any role that it considers appropriate to deceive, to lie, and to take in the good faith of Western peoples. In 1970, a U.S. Congress study group visited Brazil and gave this summary of statements by American military advisors there. Rather than dwell on the authoritarian aspects of the regime, they emphasize assertions by the Brazilian armed forces that they believe in and support representative democracy as an ideal and would return government to civilian control if this could be done without sacrifice to security and development. This withdrawal from the political arena is not seen as occurring in the near future. For that reason, they emphasize the continued importance of the military assistance training program as a means of exerting U.S. influence and retaining the current pro-U.S. attitude of the Brazilian armed forces. Possible disadvantages to U.S. interests in being so closely identified with an authoritarian regime are not seen as particularly important. The CIA never rests. A footnote. The New York Times reported in 1966, when the CIA learned last year that a Brazilian youth had been killed in 1963, allegedly in an auto accident while studying on a scholarship at the Lumumba University in Moscow. It mounted a massive publicity campaign to discourage other South American families from sending their youngsters to the Soviet Union. Yeah. Okay. Somebody indicated to me earlier that I guess they're done with Sticker Club thing. So I guess we can, well, let me take a look and see if there's anyone. I noticed that both Nekua and Hanao have ended rated out even, so yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll just raid into this purple cat thing. A gamer stream? A gamer stream is more likely than you think. I think it's been a little bit since I raided into this person. They ask what I'm doing. Well, no, I'm just going to say that I have to raid and run. And I'm going to be like, sorry, I can't tell you about this. Crimes of the CIA book that I've been reading. I don't know. I think most people probably won't have much to say about that. They'll just be like, oh, cool. I'm doubting myself once again. Maybe people will actually be like, fuck yeah, the CIA sucks big donkey balls. No, I mean, support for the US government is probably at an all-time low, so, you know, whatever. Domestically and abroad, so, but yeah, I'm just gonna raid this person. Actually, let me check. I've only been streaming for half an hour. Looks like they're streaming Raiden World right now, which appears to be one of their favorite video games, since I think that's what I've seen them streaming like 50% of the time. They're like, it looks like they're setting up their mod list right now, or something. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna raid out, and then me and Muddy, we're gonna go to Costco and get pizza. It's gonna be really messed up. Damn, didn't know Costco set up a military base in Australia. No. Do so. No, there are U.S. There's at least one U.S. military base in Australia anyway, but no, Costco's got American vibes. I mean it is whatever. All right. Thanks for listening, gamers. Um, next time I will probably, hopefully, doing another art stream, trying to finish up stuff. Mentioned I've only got 7 days left on my Live 2D license. Now I've got like 5 days. That was 2 days ago, so now I just got 5 days left. It's gonna be 4 days left actually after today. I want to finish that one Live 2D thing for Willow. I mean, I guess it's not a big deal if it runs out because I can still use that like month-long trial. And Muddy said that she will assist in the purchasing of another 3-year license student discount. Did you know that? Oh, Ray's about to go. Did you know that you can only do the student discount once per address, email address? That's not very cash money. All right, good night, bye bye. Don't forget to brush. Don't forget to drink water. All right. Yeah. Oh my god, it's got a funny voice. Got a squeaky little robot voice.